So initially I was interested in what delusions were. So I participated in the debate about whether they are beliefs or they are something else, whether they are rational or irrational. But instead, what I'd like to do today, and that's a project that has been making me quite busy for the last 2-3 years, is to think about why it matters that we talk about delusions, that we describe other people's beliefs as delusional, whether there is anything important in the way in which we use the word delusion. And I have to say that the initial interest in this question has really emerged during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, there was quite a lot of attention dedicated to some unusual beliefs that people were endorsing or at least reporting concerning, for instance, the origins of the virus or the nature of the vaccines that were being first produced and then distributed. And a lot of conspiracy beliefs were emerging, different conspiracy beliefs in different countries, which I, again, think it's really, really interesting. And some of the commentators on the popular press were describing these beliefs as delusional. And also in some neuroscience journals, some academic journals, people were trying to think quite systematically about the analogies and disanalogies between clinical delusions, which are symptoms of conditions that some people think are mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, dementia, amnesia, OCD, and so on. And these other beliefs, which are very common in the general population, at least in some groups, they're shared by some groups, and yet they seem somehow to share some of the characters, some of the features of clinical delusions. So I got interested in what we mean by delusion in our lay language. It's very likely that a psychiatrist psychiatrists think of delusions as a symptom of a mental disorder, for instance. But I wonder what goes in our heads when we describe other people as delusional or their beliefs as delusional. So that was the motivation for the project. And in particular, I wanted to understand a little bit more the phenomenon of delusion attribution, which I will describe in a second. And I think when we're thinking about what happens when, let's say, an interpreter is faced with a speaker who reports a certain belief and says, "Oh, you're delusional," or "You cannot really believe that, it's a delusion," or something like that. What is it that they mean by that? I mean, that may be a shorthand for something else that needs to be further analyzed. And an interesting question is this: once we have analyzed it, can it apply both to symptoms of mental health conditions and to beliefs that are quite unusual, but they are not a clinical phenomenon, at least they are not associated with a specific diagnosis. And so one hypothesis that I want to develop is that maybe we've got something in mind when we are thinking about a belief as delusional. We have this sense that they are implausible to us, these beliefs. They are unshakable, so it's quite difficult for us to persuade the speaker that the belief is false or that they should give it up. And also, they are identity beliefs. So they somehow both reflect who we think we are, but also kind of shape who we think we are. So they're kind of central to our conception of ourselves. Now, the implausibility, the unshakability, and the centrality to the speaker's identity, I think, are, at least to some extent, epistemic features of delusions. So they have to do with evidence, with whether something is true or false, with knowledge, maybe knowledge of ourselves. But then, of course, I think there are also other features that we associate with delusional beliefs that are not necessarily epistemic. For instance, what kind of benefits or costs delusions have. And I think it's very clear that in our everyday delusion attribution, when we say, "Oh, you're delusional," what we mean is not just that the person is not being, her best rational self, but also that the belief that they have actually may cause harm either to the speaker herself or to a social group that is connected with the speaker, or even to society at large. And I think the harm is actually quite interesting because it kind of explains why the notion of delusion has kind of been extended from the clinical dimension to the dimension, for instance, of conspiracy beliefs. And I would argue also recently extremist beliefs. So I want to look at also cost and benefits very briefly. And then I want to finally get to the point. So why is it that it matters to think about delusion attribution? Well, I think it matters because it can make us reflect on our mutual interactions, what happens when we talk to each other, what happens when we have radically different beliefs from each other, and also in kind of nuanced understanding of what delusions are and what we do when we make delusion attribution can improve potentially our interactions, especially when there are these very different perspectives that seem to be very difficult to reconcile when there is what we may call polarization in this context. And finally, I suggest that maybe the way we should think about how we can reshape our interactions, for instance, in situations of crisis like the pandemic was, is to adopt something like the agential stance when we are playing the part of the interpreters. So that's the plan. So an example of a clinical delusion, I don't think I need to give examples to this audience, but it's always quite useful to hear how people talk about their beliefs and their experiences. And this comes from the beautiful memoir by Wong. And she says, I turn my head and in a single moment realize that my coworkers have been replaced by robots, or glance at my sewing table as the thought settles over me, fine and gray as soot, that I am dead. So I think it's a beautiful passage where she describes what she was experiencing, which almost integrates two quite bizarre delusions. One is the Capgras delusion, where we think that someone we know has been replaced either by a clone or by a robot, or anyway by an imposter. And also the Cotard delusion, which is the belief that we are dead or disembodied. So these are examples of clinical delusions that are quite kind of difficult content to believe, definitely. Sorry, I went back. But here is instead a report from someone who describes what he was thinking when he was in the grip of a conspiracy theory. And at the moment when he's describing it, he has given up the conspiracy belief. But he says, I believe that Trump was leading the fight against the cabal. I was looking forward to the execution of Hillary Clinton, whom Q portrayed as a pedophile and a murderer. I would have cheered. So he's kind of describing and he's describing it with horror. So he says, I can't even believe that was me, but those are the beliefs that I had at the time. So, I mean, the point of putting side by side, next to each other, a report of a clinical delusion, Wong had schizophrenia, diagnosis of schizophrenia, with the report of a conspiracy belief, is to notice that, of course, the content is different, possibly the experiences that these people were having were very different. And certainly the social context was very different, because in the case of the delusion, you tend to be quite isolated because the belief is idiosyncratic to you. In the case of the conspiracy belief, the belief is shared in a well-defined social group. And yet, when you think about the epistemic features of the belief, you see a lot of similarities, like there is a lot of implausibility from the perspective of a neutral interpreter, someone who doesn't necessarily endorse the conspiracy theory or doesn't necessarily share the delusional beliefs. And also this idea that, it doesn't transpire really from the reports, but that the beliefs are very difficult to give up. They tend to stay with the person for quite a long time. So what do we mean when we talk about delusion attribution? One way of looking at beliefs, which I find very attractive because it's demystifying, is that beliefs are the kind of things that we attribute to each other when we try to explain each other's behavior and predict each other's future behavior. Now, in this kind of situation, you've got a triangulation, Davidson was saying. So you've got the interpreter, you've got the speaker, and you got the environment, which is shared between the interpreter and the speaker, although the way in which the speaker looks at the environment may be very different from the way in which the interpreter looks at the environment. So this is kind of the triangle of belief attribution, and we can think of delusion attribution in these terms, thinking that, in some situations, the interpreter will attribute to the speaker a delusional belief. So the question is, what needs to happen for the interpreter to make the attribution? Now, there is a very excellent paper by Sam Wilkinson, which was published 2-3 years ago in the European Journal of Analytic Philosophy, where he argues that delusion attribution should be seen in an expressivist way. So what he's saying is that the project of trying to define delusions by looking at criteria that all beliefs need to be able to meet in order to count as delusions is not a worthwhile project. Because when we attribute delusions to other people, we're doing it in an expressivist way. So we're not describing what people are doing. We're not imposing certain criteria on them and finding that they meet them or they don't meet them. But we are expressing a certain reaction that we have that is mostly an emotional reaction, and which he describes as an emotion of epistemic aversion. So we find the belief epistemically disgusting or epistemically non-ideal, definitely problematic in some way. So, we shouldn't just look for the common denominators of all delusional beliefs, but just consider that a possibility is that the interpreter uses the word delusion or describes the belief as delusional when, according to the interpreter, there are clear problems that the belief has. And these have to do with a number of things. So it could be that the belief is not well supported by evidence. It could be that it's not coherent. It doesn't cohere in the belief system where it appears. It may be that it doesn't drive action in the way we would expect. So there doesn't need to be any kind of complete overlap between these features. Could be that one belief is delusional for one reason, another belief is delusional for another reason. But what they all have in common is that the interpreter has this negative reaction to it. And so there is this kind of folk epistemic disapproval towards the belief. So it's almost as if the interpreter was saying to the speaker, boo to you for having this belief. You shouldn't have it. And in a way, I think this is a really interesting way of looking at it, because we do use the word delusion in a very kind of value-laden way. I mean, it's an evaluative term. If you're saying you're delusional, what we're saying is you're out of your mind, or I shouldn't take you seriously, right? So there are implications in the way in which we use the word delusion that seems to be evaluative in this way. However, I think that we can do a little bit more work in trying to understand what the evaluation refers to. So Wilkinson doesn't want to go farther than that. He says, okay, it's folk epistemic disapproval. That's it. What I want to do is to try and think about why is it that there is the disapproval? What drives the disapproval? And the aim is not to get to a complete kind of perfect definition of delusion, but rather to try and understand a little bit better what is it that causes this disruption in communication. So my hypothesis, which I'm putting to you, is that the interpreter disapproves of the speaker's belief because the belief is an unshakable identity belief that the interpreter finds implausible, that the interpreter doesn't share. Now, you may wonder why I've chosen these characteristics, and I'm going to try and argue a little bit for each of them. But the thought is that there is a core epistemic notion of delusion that these characteristics seem to capture. And that could explain why we tend to use the word delusion for, the clinical phenomenon and maybe the conspiracy belief, maybe something else. It's not that they are exactly the same phenomenon. Of course, there are important differences, but there is this core of something epistemically problematic about them that is in common. So when we're talking about implausibility, unshakability, and centrality to the person's identity, in my eyes, at least, you can tell me if you disagree, it's really trying to capture the epistemic feature of the phenomenon. Of course, there are other features that are important when we're thinking about delusions. As I said, the dimension of consequences of having the belief, the harm, the costs, the benefits. What is it that the delusion enables us to do or prevents us from doing? And I think those are just as important, but they don't really fit this kind of epistemic core. Okay, so let's start with implausibility. Why am I going for implausibility? There is a vast literature on whether we should consider delusions as false. In a lot of definitions of delusions, including the DSM definition, the one in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the fact that the belief is false is central. However, in philosophy, a lot of authors have challenged the idea that delusions need to be false. And they've challenged it on the basis of different points, different arguments. So some people think that what is central to the delusion is that the belief is not well supported by evidence. But actually, the belief could be true. It's just that lacks this important relationship with supporting evidence. And the classic example is the delusion of jealousy. Someone may think that his partner is being unfaithful, and it is actually true that his partner is being unfaithful, but the reasons he provides for believing that the partner is unfaithful or the kind of evidence that he has at his disposal do not seem to support the content of the belief. So you could have a case where the content of the delusion is actually true, but the belief is still a delusion because there is this unusual relationship with evidence. Some people think that it's more to do with the fact that the delusion is not sensitive to evidence. So when there is kind of counter evidence, the person doesn't seem to alter their behavior in such a way as to acknowledge that a challenge has been made. But in general, I think, if you think about the ethics of belief slogan by Stapford, it's not what you believe, but how you believe. That's the basic idea. When you're ascribing a delusion, it's not what you are believing that matters, because you've got some really bizarre delusions, but some really mundane delusions as well. It's how you believe. There is something wrong in how you get to have that belief or you get to keep that belief, given the circumstances. Also, I wanted to capture this relational idea, right? Because delusion attribution is a relationship between an interpreter and the speaker. And of course, in any conversation, we are both the interpreter and the speaker at any one time. We swap these roles continuously. And I think what is really important is that for the speaker, the delusion is not false and is not badly supported by evidence. For the speaker, it's usually obviously true. It's the interpreter that has this different perspective. And so I wanted to capture this kind of relational aspect. And also I was thinking about the notion of implausibility. Like the notion of implausibility is interesting because it is about the content of the belief, but it is not an intrinsic feature of the content of the belief. When we think that something is implausible, it's because we think that it doesn't fit with something else, maybe with the other things that we believe. So I was looking at the etymology of implausibility, which it comes from the Latin, plaudere is like to approve. And basically, when you say that something is plausible, you approve of it, right? You think that it's easy to believe. But when something is implausible, you disapprove of it. So you don't find it easy to believe, you find it difficult to believe. And I think that's exactly the idea behind this relationship between interpreter and speaker when the interpreter ascribes a delusional belief to the speaker. For the speaker, it is difficult to believe, for the interpreter, it is difficult to believe what the speaker is saying because what the speaker is saying doesn't fit very well with the things that the interpreter believes. And sometimes doesn't fit very well even with the things that the speaker themselves believe. So in my silly example on the slide, someone may say, oh, I've seen a dinosaur. And an interpreter says, you cannot possibly have seen a dinosaur. Dinosaurs are extinct, maybe it was a big lizard or something. It's because, the belief that the speaker is reporting doesn't fit well with what we know about dinosaurs, right? So that's the idea of implausibility as opposed to focusing on truth or whether something is bizarre or not. In addition to that, there is this relationship with evidence that we need to unpack a little bit. And it's very common to hear that delusions are not well supported by evidence and they are not sensitive to counter-evidence. But I think that's a problematic way of describing what is wrong with delusions from an epistemic point of view. First of all, it's not clear that delusions are always badly supported by evidence. It strongly depends on how broad or narrow your notion of evidence is. So even for people who end up endorsing quite unusual beliefs, as in the examples that we saw at the beginning, it's actually quite possible that they have had life experiences that could, in principle, support that particular belief content. Of course, they must have had other life experiences that do not support the belief content. But certainly what we cannot say, I think, is that delusion is always groundless, that there is no ground on which we can base the delusion. Very often, some experiences, for instance, of bullying and child abuse are something that might motivate delusions of persecution later in life. And indeed, bullying and child abuse are risk factors for schizophrenia later in life, especially persecutory delusions. So there is a sense in which someone who hasn't had any good reason to trust other people, not even the people who were supposed to take care of them when they were vulnerable, it makes sense for them not to trust people in the future, new people that they come to encounter in their lives. And similarly, with conspiracy beliefs, we have a similar, I think, a similar dynamic. And many psychologists have noticed how a lot of the people who are attracted to conspiracy theories are marginalized and belong to groups that have been excluded from public participation, whose interests have not been taken into account. So again, if you have a history of being dismissed, not being cared for, then why should you trust the authorities when they tell you what is going on? So saying that they are justified in their beliefs, that's very different, right? But I'm saying that they're not groundless beliefs. They're not beliefs that, you cannot imagine how they came about. You can reconstruct, why they came about in that way, why they have the content they do. Sometimes it's just that they are not the best explanation for the person's experience. What is sensitivity to evidence? I'm sure, people are very attached to this idea that delusions are not sensitive to evidence. And here I want to say something quite, I want to make a distinction. There is a sense in which delusions are sensitive to evidence. So if you talk to someone you attribute the delusion to, they're very likely to engage with you. They're very likely to listen to what you have to say. They're very likely to recognize that what you have to say is a challenge to their belief, and to kind of participate in this game of exchanging reasons. And indeed, we have this phenomenon, which is common both with clinical delusions and with conspiracy beliefs, that people tend to change their belief after they discuss it with people who don't necessarily endorse that belief. They tend to make it even more articulate, to elaborate it, because they want to kind of preempt the challenges that they are being faced with. So there is this sense that there is a sensitivity to evidence because the speaker is disposed to change their belief in conversation with people who do not share the same belief. But what is not happening is that at the end of this exchange, the speaker is prepared to give up the belief. That is what is not happening. So I want to kind of say, okay, if we just say the delusion is insensitive to evidence, we are missing this phenomenon where actually people do engage in the game of exchanging reasons. At the same time, they do not admit that they can lose that game. So it's like playing a card game with a 5-year-old. I don't know whether you have had this experience. They understand the rules. They know that they have to take turns. They know, the conditions for winning the game. But if at the end of the game, they are the ones who have lost, they are not going to accept that. they're going to scream and say, it's not fair. And it seems to me that in a way, there is something similar here. There is an intention to play the game, but there is not really a true, a genuine openness to changing their mind about the content of the belief. So that's why I'm talking about unshakability here instead of insensitivity to evidence. And I'm doing it because in the literature, for instance, on conspiracy belief, that's very often the mark of a conspiracy belief, unshakability. I'm thinking about climate change denial, for instance. The problem is not that what they say is obviously false. The problem is that they do not seem to accept a certain type of evidence that other people think is authoritative as a reason to change their belief. Okay, so the final bit is a bit about identity. So this comes from a very strong intuition, and I'm curious to know whether you share it, because this is fairly new, I think, in the literature, but a very strong intuition that people care about their delusional beliefs. It's not that the delusional belief is something peripheral, that happens to them, but, they're kind of indifferent to it. The delusional belief may start out as something not so important, but at some point, it becomes quite central to how the person sees herself in the context of their social and physical environment. It becomes something that they recognize themselves in. And so this is quite easy to see with clinical delusions. In some of the clinical literature, you've got expressions like people are obsessed with the delusion, or the delusion takes up all their energy, or everything seems to contribute to the delusion. All the experiences they're having are kind of interpreted in the light of the delusion. There is this idea that the delusion slowly takes over, which I think is very interesting. But also in the conspiracy theories literature, you find this idea that people tend to recognize themselves in the belief that they have and in the groups that seem to endorse that kind of belief. So you've got these labels, I'm a Trump supporter or a climate change denialist or whatever it is. So people kind of identify themselves with a particular group, and they tend to see themselves as someone who has that belief, because very often the fact that they have the belief says to themselves and to the rest of the world something about themselves that matters. So in the book, I have this example of, this is a true story, but a health, kind of a holistic health guru who during the pandemic said that she wasn't worried about COVID because she didn't think that germ transmission was true. So she didn't think that illnesses could be transmitted through germs. And she thought that what was really killing people was the fear that, that they might get COVID. So what was interesting about this, it was, okay, it's another case of COVID denialism, a little bit more bizarre than some other cases, but it was kind of embedded in a whole philosophy that she had about medical intervention being bad, about natural remedies for everything, about solving things by regulating your emotions rather than getting prescriptions and so on. And this is, I think, quite an interesting example because it applies to a lot of these cases. The conspiracy belief is not kind of circumscribed. It becomes something that links to many other things that you may believe, maybe distrust of science, maybe distrust of the government, or so on. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to think that the delusion is about yourself or that the delusion, defines who you are, but the delusion takes space and becomes something that is quite central to how you see yourself in relation to others. Okay, so I said I would say something quick about, I will try and wrap it up now. Something very quick about non-epistemic features. I think when we think about delusions, we tend to think about costs, how harmful and disruptive they are to our lives. And I think that's the right way of thinking about it. Many delusions are harmful and disruptive. But I also think that one aspect of delusions that we don't tend to see very much is the fact that they may have positive consequences for the speaker. So we, in particular with the case of clinical delusions, one thing that is really bad about them is that by being idiosyncratic and not shared, they may cause isolation and stigma. And that is something that affects the lives of people who live with schizophrenia, for instance, in a very negative way. But we may also want to ask whether, it's the environment in which they live that contributes to that by being an environment that really tends to exclude people with unusual beliefs. The other aspect of it, the other side of it, is that delusion very often is adopted to explain something important that has happened to the person. And so it's a way of making sense of things. And by making sense, even if it's not perfect sense, or there are better explanations out there, generally gives a sense of relief to the speaker and enables the speaker to cope with some situations. That, and this is something that maybe the interpreter doesn't necessarily realize. It's something that would be helpful to know when we are attributing delusions to people. Okay, you know, that it's an implausible belief, it's unshakable, but maybe there is a reason why the person is endorsing it in that way. So ultimately, why is it that delusion attribution matters? Understanding how interpreters attribute delusions helps us kind of discover these kind of assumptions that we make about other people when we hear beliefs that we do not share. But I think also if we are nuanced enough to recognize that the delusion plays some roles that are important to the speaker, we may realize that we ourselves have, you know, our own delusions that for an interpreter may be quite implausible and difficult to accept, and that we are not going to give up in the face of evidence, very, very likely. That means that delusions are not always a sign of irrationality. Very often they will be, but they don't need to be. And the most important thing, leaving rationality aside, they are not necessarily an indication that the speaker is no longer an agent, is no longer someone that is worth talking to, that is worth trying to understand. And so this idea that we can just dismiss someone's view or someone's opinion because what they're saying is implausible to us and kind of unshakable, I think is something that we should overcome. So when they report delusion, speakers manifest their agency. It's not a limitation of their agency. But what they're doing is, first of all, they express aspects of their identity, aspects of themselves that are important to them. And second, they're trying to make sense of their experiences, which I think is a core feature of agency. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that maybe we can improve on the intentional stance and adopt something like the agential stance. Recognize that the people we talk to, whether or not they are reporting beliefs that we consider to be plausible, should be treated like agents. And so we should engage with their views and we should maintain a certain level of curiosity. Even if we are never going to change our mind about the content of their beliefs, what that does is help us understand how they got to their beliefs. And in that way, develop an empathetic attitude towards them that can avoid certain pernicious ways of polarizing debates. So when they report delusions, speakers manifest agency, ultimately. Sorry, I'm going back. Last slide. This is just an idea of what the agential stance might mean, involving people in decision-making, affirming their capacity to participate in debate, not labeling them prematurely as irrational, for instance, and also validating their experiences and perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was wonderful. So we have a few minutes for questions. We'll go with raising your hand way. So, Richard.
I think you're muted. I think Richard is muted.
Yes, we're not hearing you.
Sorry about that. I'm okay now. Okay, thank you for your talk, Lisa. The thought I had listening to how we might all hold beliefs that are resistant to contrary evidence, and that got me thinking about the Weber belief, the a notion that Quine has, the philosopher Quine, and I wonder whether the beliefs that are most resistant to change, to alternative evidence, are the beliefs that are most central to the Weber belief, and that the beliefs on the periphery of the Weber belief might be much more open to change. And I wonder if that could apply to people with delusions as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. That's very close to my way of thinking about it. So I think the recognition that delusions are identity beliefs really can explain why they're so resistant to change. It's because if you had to change the delusion, you'd have to change the way you think about yourself. And so you'd have almost to go through something like a conversion, a Kuhnian conversion, where you have to think that, oh, wow, it's not just one little belief that has to change. It's my whole system of beliefs that is put into question. So that's very close to the way I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Simas, then Rush.
Hi, and thank you very much. That was really interesting, but it made me think why you don't want to include some kind of connection with truth or what is the case, because that way there seem to be a lot of conditions that might fall under your characterization, which intuitively I don't find them to be delusional. Like imagine, I don't know, I'm a human rights defender in a society where people think otherwise, then I would be in a situation where, my beliefs are difficult to believe, because, how can someone believe that everybody should have the same rights? I might be, this idea might be very difficult for me to give up, and I might take it to be part of my identity. I mean, that happens with human rights, but for instance, with being a materialist, or I don't know, or being a dualist, which either way, I don't know what is the case, but I know none of those positions might be delusional, but nonetheless that might be part of the identity, at least what the people do as work for living, etc., etc. And then I'm a little bit, so something that there might be missing. Can you please help me there? Thank you.
You got it absolutely right. You're not missing anything. Yeah, so that's one thing that I find attractive about thinking about the attribution situation, instead of thinking about defining delusions as if they were a natural kind or something. The attribution situation really makes you think about what is it that we're doing when we're calling something delusion. And definitely, one way I put it, for instance, in my writing is to say, someone's cherished belief is someone else's delusion. And if you're thinking about some kind of very polarized political debates, that seems definitely right. So something that, you may never want to give up, maybe something that for the other person is super important, or it should be rejected straight away. Now, introducing truth, I think, doesn't really help, just because delusion is mostly an epistemic concept that has to do with the relationship with evidence. And, we all know that there were theories that were considered conspiracy theories, and then they turned out to be correct. And, and we all know that some delusions have true belief content. So I think that doesn't help in any case. But certainly people will press me on this evidence thing. And there, I think it's tricky. And the way I would go about it was to say, we need to be very broad and liberal about the notion of evidence, what counts as evidence for a belief. And I will have to say, what counts as good evidence for a belief to you may not count as good evidence for the interpreter of a speaker, depending on what your role is. Because of this idea that actually in some situations, and the conspiracy belief situation is probably better than the clinical delusion situation to illustrate this, the idea is not that the climate change denialist is not sensitive to evidence that comes from climate science. It's just that they don't take that to be evidence. They don't respect it as evidence. They think that, it's a fabrication or it's propaganda or something else. So the attitude that changes is not just about the content of the belief. The attitude is about what counts as evidence. So I think it becomes really tricky to try and, describe what is wrong with delusions by talking about their being insensitive to evidence, because again, you need to make some assumptions about the interpreter and the speaker sharing some methodological convictions about what counts as good evidence for a certain type of belief in a certain context. So I kind of embrace the relativity of this situation, and the thought that, in some situations, my being a feminist, for instance, can be considered a delusion, because I'm not going to give it up, that women can do everything that men do, or maybe better. And no matter what argument people are going to throw at me, right? Then one thing that can help, I think, is the non-epistemic features. So when you go to the non-epistemic features, I think you have ways of distinguishing, because you can talk about harm, you can talk about disruption, you can talk about what it is that the delusion doesn't enable you to do. But ultimately, I kind of accept the challenge. I don't have a good answer, satisfactory answer to your question.
Thank you. I don't know, we're short in time, right, Federico? So make something that it's might be helpful to think about this. It's like, first of all, be sure whether the project is descriptive or normative, whether it's a project about how do we indeed, no, I mean, I'm not explaining that, sorry. Whether it's normative or descriptive, and then be able to accommodate, for example, philosophical discussions. So because I never think that my opponent is delusional, despite the fact that, they might not take for granted my argument. They say, no, yeah, I cannot say anything, those sort of things. So that might be helpful, like something like the kind of counterexample that came to my mind. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So I'm going with the evaluative thing. So I'm thinking of delusion, at least for this project, as an evaluative concept, not as a descriptive concept. But, the step that I'm making beyond Wilkinson's argument about expressivism is that I think that the evaluative content can be further examined, let's say.
So Raj, and then Aida.
Great, thank you. So super interesting talk. Thank you for sharing with us. The slide that you had about delusions not necessarily starting off as self. I'm forgetting the word that you used. It was
self-related or self-defining.
Yeah, self-related. Was new to me, and I think a really interesting point that I've been thinking about a lot now. And something we might be interested in, I don't know if we are, but maybe we would be interested in carving out clinical delusions from the types of delusional beliefs that might qualify as conspiracy theories. We might hold that for pragmatic reasons of like, okay, who are we going to provide treatment for these sorts of delusions? And actually what you gave as a delusion that does not start off as self-relating but becomes central to self-identity actually seemed at first glance a good way to divide those, that a conspiracy theory would be something that doesn't start off self-relating and then becomes central to the identity, while a clinical delusion, it may be a necessary condition of that. I don't know that I would go that far, but it might be the case that clinical delusions do start off as self-relating and remain central to self-identity. So I was just curious what you thought about,
that's really interesting. And it is something that I've been asked before in different ways, and I've been thinking a little bit about. So someone, for instance, was asking me, isn't the case that all clinical delusions are about the self one way or another? And I had to think about that. And it's not obvious, is it? Because, okay, my wife is having an affair, sure. My husband is being replaced by an imposter, yes. But, in some situations, it's not really obvious. So, in some delusions of persecution, someone believes that, people are being gradually replaced by aliens. Okay, you may be thinking, yeah, of course, it affects me as well, but it's not about me, right? But there is something that is about the person at all times. And interestingly, that is shared also by conspiracy beliefs, which is this idea of epistemic superiority. So the person with the delusion, when challenged, would say, I know best. I have a special access to the truth in the particular domain of the delusion, not in general, but in particular domain of the delusion. So they have this sense that they are in a better place than their interlocutors, for instance, and their challengers in establishing the truth of that particular matter. So in a way, it is self-related. And psychologists explore these kind of things, like the need for uniqueness, for instance, is quite interesting. So you need to feel, it is an epistemic version of it. You need to feel that you're different from others, but you need to feel that, you can do things than others in some situations. And so there is this illusion of superiority that is a common bias in psychology. And I like to think of this as kind of an illusion of epistemic superiority. For the domain of the delusion, I'm the expert. And I think that's interestingly shared with the conspiracy belief, although I agree with you that there are other features that do not overlap so easily in the two contexts.
I see. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Aida?
Yes. Hi. Thank you. That was very interesting. So I actually had a question regarding your notion of delusions. So it seemed to be that there was some kind of epistemic violation, norm violation in the case of delusions. And I was wondering if that assumes that the function of beliefs, the role, it's mainly epistemic, or whether it's not, because I think maybe something that separates these conspiracy theories, for instance, from clinical delusions is that maybe they are held for other reasons that are not to get the world right. Like, for instance, you may want to signal that you belong to that same group and that membership to the group is more important maybe than your epistemic stance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a brilliant question. So I think you're absolutely right that there is something quite specific to conspiracy beliefs when it comes to signaling, for instance, wanting to belong to a certain group or wanting a certain affiliation. But I do think that the whole point of introducing delusions as identity beliefs was to make the case that a belief is never just for representing reality. Representing reality is one of the functions of belief, but then you've got another function, and it's basically kind of developing a sense of who you are and making these kind of signals about what your commitments are, and creating a kind of an image of yourself for yourself and for other people that enables socialization. So that is something that I discuss actually when I talk about the identity feature of delusions, relying on a lot of the recent social epistemology literature that focuses on the alternative functions of delusion, especially in terms of creating coalitions, making sure that people collaborate with you, and so on. So kind of very clear kind of evolutionary arguments for thinking that beliefs may have these kind of roles. So I guess the main difference is that there are some people who think that beliefs don't have the epistemic role at all. So they're just for the other stuff, just for the kind of social role that they have, and that they enable us to behave in a certain way, or get other people to behave with us in a way that is advantageous with us. I tend to like more the approach where there is a plurality of functions of belief, so that they have different roles. And so the epistemic role is one, not necessarily the dominant, but it's one of the functions that they have. So I think there are things that we can say about delusions, both when it comes to their epistemic role, how they represent reality for us, and also the kind of more social or, the role that they have in helping us develop certain strategic aims that may be social, maybe of the relationship with the environment that we might need. So for me, it's, I tend to think at the moment that it's more of a plurality, and that explains why some beliefs that are, epistemically very problematic, they are very difficult to give up. It's because they do very well something else that is not representing reality, but helping us see the world in a way that is advantageous to us and supports our agency.
Can I do a quick follow-up? But I took it that your view of delusion attribution was merely epistemic, like it's like a saying boo to that belief you hold, like it's not epistemically well supported only.
Yeah. So the expressivism was Wilkinson's view. I'm not sure I'm fully expressivist about delusion attribution. But implausibility and unshakability are almost entirely epistemic. I think the role of delusions as identity belief is partly epistemic, because it has to do with self-knowledge and self-representation, and is partly non-epistemic because it has to do with supporting agency and developing kind of relationships with other agents that are good or bad for us. So the notion of identity belief is not exclusively epistemic.
So we are a bit behind schedule, but I will, if you allow me, introduce one final question myself. I was wondering, Lisa, about what I see as a possibility, maybe not a possibility I am particularly drawn to, but as a possibility that has not surfaced in the discussion, which is that the difference between clinical delusions and these sort of unusual beliefs is that the former occur in the context of a pathology and the latter do not. So that maybe there is something about like the causal underpinnings of what is going on that that gives us a contrast between normal range, fallible, suboptimal outcomes, and bad outcomes that are the result of a pathology. I mean, that would of course be of no help to try to identify which beliefs are delusional in the clinical sense and which are not, but it may be a view on what the fundamental difference is, even if you cannot, even if it doesn't help if you're dealing with the surface features. I mean, why is that not the answer?
Okay, now that's a very good question. So my view is that delusions are not pathological, not even clinical delusions. So I think that delusions can be part of a pathology, but they're not pathological beliefs. But that, we can leave that on the in the background. I think what, the best answer to your question would be to say it's very difficult to make a sharp distinction between clinical delusions and conspiracy beliefs based on whether they are the kind of thing that attracts medical attention, let's say, or that warrants medical intervention. A lot of clinical delusions have exactly the grammatical form of a conspiracy belief. So a lot of clinical delusions are about, aliens are replacing everybody around me. I'm the only one who knows this. It's a huge conspiracy. The word conspiracy is very often used, especially in people with schizophrenia, to describe what they think is going on. And there are very, very strong connections between paranoia and persecutory delusions and conspiracy beliefs. So, you'd have to make a decision. Okay, I'm not calling this a conspiracy belief because it's part of schizophrenia, but you'd be that type of decision that you decide to demarcate it in that way, not because of the form of the belief itself. Similarly, there are some cases of conspiracy theories where the person gets to, attract medical attention on the basis of their beliefs, even if they don't have a kind of more standard mental health diagnosis. In general, I think when you're thinking about someone with delusions as requiring medical attention, as having a pathology, you're looking at the complexity of the person's life. So you're looking at their beliefs, but not just that. You're looking at the effects of their beliefs on their well-being. You're looking at the presence of other symptoms. You're looking at the relationship with other people. You're looking at their capacity to function in society, keep a job, maintain a relationship with their families, and so on. It's never just because they have an unusual belief. And indeed, there are many cases of people with delusional beliefs, delusional in the sense that the content of the belief, is something that other people will not endorse, very idiosyncratic, almost impossible to happen. And yet, because their life is not disrupted in the way that we would expect, the clinical teams decide not to intervene. Or there is, no kind of medical intervention that is suggested. So I wonder, why we need this kind of pathology versus non-pathology kind of distinction. To me, it's not very helpful. Like, does someone need help from a doctor? Okay, they can go to the doctor. someone doesn't need help from the doctor, they can manage by themselves or with their support groups. But to kind of label something pathological at the level of the single belief, to me, doesn't seem very helpful or even kind of theoretically sound.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, and thanks for the talk and the discussion. This has been great.
Thanks to all of you for your interesting questions.
So next up in our schedule is Raj Duda. Is that, I hope, the correct way of pronouncing your name? You tell us. And he's going to be discussing delusions as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so we were just on the cutting edge of discussions and delusions. Is this showing up? Can you all see the slides that I have up? Hold on.
It's still loading.
Hold on. Is this okay? If that is okay, how about this? Is that up? Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so we were just on the forefront of new discussions and delusions, and now we're going to go backwards a little bit. So this is based on work that I did last year as an undergraduate at UNC Chapel Hill, where I spent many a late trip to the library to see actually Lisa's book. So delusions and other irrational beliefs. So it's really great to be here. Thank you to the organizers. And I'll just kind of jump right into it. So just to give a little bit of a roadmap for what I'm going to be talking about here, these are really the 5 points. Since we've already talked about some of these in detail, I'll be able to hopefully speed through some of them. But first, we'll start with just like a discussion to get on the same page about some general features of delusions. And then next, we'll kind of use that to set up what the doxastic view of delusions is. That is the view that delusions are beliefs. And then talk a little bit about the challenges based on those features that have caused some challenges for the doxastic view. And then the third and fourth points are kind of in the paper. What I had originally introduced, and these ideas are, as you'll see, based on our Q&A session in the last one, these ideas are not so new anymore, but kind of a way to structure that discussion. So the first of the two new points that I'll kind of introduce are how there are non-evidential motivations for belief formation, and how this can help us respond to some of the challenges that we might get to the doxastic view of delusions. And then the second one is about belief compartmentalization, and this implicit and explicit to like, that's like a rough approximation of a way that we might carve up the beliefs that somebody has. I think that's a non-pathological, I think that's just a feature of us and how we believe that we have some implicit and some explicit beliefs. But if we're willing to adopt this, we're able to make sense of some of the features of delusions that would otherwise be quite puzzling in the doxastic view of delusions. And these bolded terms that I have of evidence resistance and double bookkeeping, we'll talk a little bit once we get into the features of delusions. And then finally, I'm going to try to tie this all up by, answering the question, well, who cares? Like, why does it matter that we've updated the doxastic view or modified it in this way? And what does it help us explain? So that's our roadmap for where we're headed. So coming up with a definition of delusions is notoriously challenging because there's very little about any definition that is uncontentious. But as the APA holds in the DSM-5, which we've been having conversations about in the past few sessions, reads that delusions are fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. Kind of like we just talked about in the 4th edition of this was written as delusions are false beliefs. But as Lisa gave us the example, you may end up having a delusion that ends up being true, even though you lacked anywhere near the sufficient evidence to believe it. So that's why we have this modification as of 2013. The APA says fixed beliefs. So instead of trying to give you and adhere to a strong, like, one-liner definition of what delusions are, I decided that I would try to pick out some of the features of delusions. So these are not exhaustive. These features are things that I picked out because they seem to me, from reading case reviews, from interacting with people that have delusions, on like the clinical side, features that delusions share or may share, and then will help set up some of the difficulty that doxastic views supposedly have. So at first face, it seems that delusions are unreasonable. Perhaps they're even irrational. We might explain this in terms of they don't agree, or if you had the same evidence that I had, potentially you would not come to the same belief that I did if I were a delusional agent. That's a little hazy. We're gonna refine that. We're gonna refine that as we move on. And then the second one that some in present company have written about is double bookkeeping. And this was, to my knowledge, first described by Bloiler back in the day when he was detailing what we would now call schizophrenia. And what he would notice is he would be on the farm, and there would be farm workers who were very insistent that they would say, "I'm the Pope. I live in the Vatican. I do popely things." But every morning they would still get up and grab their farm equipment, and they would do farm work. And he found this odd, because, well, if a delusion is being professed, or more specifically now in this discussion, if a belief is being professed and somebody acts contrary or not in accordance with it, that's strange. We think that we should, or we think that we are disposed to act in accordance with our beliefs. And then a third feature, which has gotten a lot of attention, and we've talked about in Ida's talk yesterday about evidence irresponsiveness. I phrase this as evidence resistance, because I think there are some papers showing that some delusions in some circumstances are responsive to evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about why that might be, or why I think that might be a little speculative towards the end. But it seems that delusions are resistant to counter evidence. And now I'll pick out the later of these two features and try to bring into focus why they might pose a challenge to the doxastic view of delusions. So for double bookkeeping, for example, this is an example actually from one of Lisa's papers, that if I'm professing that the nurses in my hospital are trying to poison me, but I happily eat the food that they give me, this seems like not the sort of thing that a belief does. This seems like something a delusion can do, but at first face, well, I tend to act in accordance with the things that I believe. So, I believe, for example, that I'm an MD PhD student at UC Irvine. So I wake up in the morning and then I go to class, or I come here and do philosophy things, and that seems to line up. So we might think that beliefs are action guiding. Might even think that they're constitutively so. So if that's the case, then that seems like there's a problem for the doxastic view of delusions, because delusions seem to have the potential to behave in this way that beliefs don't. And then the second one is evidence resistance. This also seems like a worry. So let's say that I believe that Kansas City is the capital of Kansas, and we're having this talk, and then one of you says, actually, Kansas City is the capital of Missouri, not of Kansas. And I would think, wow, that's very odd. But I would look up what she said. I feel, okay, it actually might not be Missouri. My knowledge of the United States is not as strong as it should be, but let's just say that I'm wrong about that. Actually, that makes the example all the better. And I revise my belief according to this new evidence, and delusions seem to not do this. in spite of these farm workers going out and working on the farm, they may still hold or seem to be deluded that they're the Pope. So this has led some commentators to think, okay, well, this view that the APA has given us in the DSM, that delusions are beliefs, maybe we need to abandon that because there are some features that are not being captured here. So some have proposed that delusions are imaginings, that the subject mistakes as being knowledge. Some have written that delusions are empty speech acts, something that I'm starting to write and think about, and a few people here at Irvine are thinking about if delusions are hinges, as described by Wittgenstein and uncertainty. Won't really talk about that here, but if we have questions about it, we can go that direction. But these are these non-doxastic views that are sort of against the traditional doxastic view, saying that, hey, there are some features here that are not being appropriately captured by the doxastic view. So the move that I want to try to make is say that, okay, it's not that delusions aren't beliefs because of these features, it's that our understanding of what beliefs are may need to be expanded. And expanding this understanding of what beliefs are is useful not just so we can accommodate delusions, but because I think it actually captures more dimensions of these non-pathological beliefs too. And as a category, expanding our understanding of beliefs in this way is going to give us a lot of explanatory power, not only over delusions, but over ordinary beliefs. So the first of these two, I take from Susanna Reinhardt's paper, Equal Treatment for Belief. She also had written before this, Pragmatic Motivations for Belief Formation, I think is the name of the paper. But the example that she gives, or one of the examples that she gives is, say I have a mysterious epistemic illness, and there's a bunch of epidemiological information on this illness, and everyone who has this illness has a 5% chance of survival. But there's an odd feature of this epistemic illness, where if the people who believe that they're going to survive have a higher chance of surviving. And the thought here is, well, my evidence seemed to suggest that I am going to die from this epistemic illness, but there are pragmatic reasons or pragmatic motivations by which I might believe the opposite, believe that I am going to survive. And what Reinhardt wants to say is that we shouldn't think of that kind of belief as making a mistake or being irrational. So she carves up the terms a little differently than I do, and she's doing different work with this kind of claim, with this kind of normative claim. But what I kind of copy and paste from that paper is the idea that we do this. We have non-evidential motivations or pragmatic considerations when we're forming our beliefs. And there are many, many reasons or causes, many motivations why we might take this on. So what this table has is basically it adds another axis to this conversation about if a delusion is what I'll call orthodox, which is basically to say it's not delusional. It's not a candidate to be a delusion. And I'll sort of talk a little bit about the axes that I have here, right? So in this top right corner, we have beliefs that are both adaptive and rational. And I think a lot of our beliefs are this way. So for example, I believe that if I'm underwater for too long, I'm going to drown. So the evidence does suggest that. And believing that is also going to help me not drown. So this is something that I think is not a candidate to be considered a delusion. Now let's consider a pain case, right? So let's say I have chronic pain. I've gone to all sorts of doctors about my chronic pain. There's nothing they can do. And, I decide to turn to acupuncture, and even some acupuncturists are like, hey, for the type of pain that you're having, this type of acupuncture is not going to work. But I go to someone and they say, hey, if you really, really, really believe that this is going to work, then it's going to work. and I end up in a spot where I believe that the acupuncture is going to work, even though the evidence doesn't suggest it. And lo and behold, the acupuncture works. But we could imagine this as like a type of placebo effect of if I don't believe in the treatment, it's not going to have the effect that it has. So this is the type of belief that's adaptive for the Asian, even though it doesn't accord or doesn't agree with the evidence surrounding it, because by all empiric measures, this type of acupuncture shouldn't help my pain. But again, I don't want to say that this kind of belief is a candidate to be a delusion, because it's very clearly adaptive. And I think that we should think of delusions as maladaptive. Then the second to last box I'll talk about is the rational but maladaptive belief. So we can take the same acupuncture case and say, okay, well, I'm actually not going to believe that, or rather, I don't believe that this acupuncture is going to help me, and the acupuncture doesn't help me. But again, I don't want to say that the Asian is doing something wrong by believing this, because they're believing what their evidence suggests, even though it is at a great personal cost to them. So that sort of leaves this last camp, what I think end up being candidates for delusional beliefs, and why I say or why they are delusional beliefs that are candidates to be delusions. And why I say that is I think there are all sorts of like irrational and maladaptive beliefs that we don't consider clinical delusions. So sexism or sexist beliefs and racist beliefs fall into this camp, I think, for the most part. And we don't consider them delusions. But I think if we're gonna sort of carve out which types of beliefs are going to be candidates for delusions, we would use this scheme to some extent. So the question then is why? Like, why did I just walk you through a 2x2 matrix where 3 of the items were the same? I think that one of the ways that we can try to explain evidence resistance or motivate evidence resistance is by thinking about the role that the delusion plays for the agent. So if it's a primarily evidential role, that is the way that we usually think of beliefs. Beliefs are perhaps, I don't know, propositional attitudes targeted at truth. Then we only have this one axis and we think, okay, well, does the belief seem to accord with the evidence that the agent has, or does it seem to not do that? And I think when we add this other dimension, we can explain why, or perhaps start to give an explanation for why delusions are not going to be evidence resistant. So, for example, if let's say I have this mysterious epistemic illness that Reinhard talks about, and I believe that I'm going to survive. And I keep getting counter evidence that, like, oh, we've run another study that shows only 5% of people with this disease survive. The reason for which I'm believing what I believe is fundamentally not evidential. So there's a case study example, and I'll move into an actual delusion now, where a man turns himself into the police and he says, hey, I sexually assaulted my girlfriend. I locked my mom in the basement after beating her up. You need to arrest me. And then girlfriend and mom come in and they say, so no, that like didn't happen. We're not like trying to defend him here. He's saying that he did all these things. These things didn't happen. And we might think, and this teeters a little bit on the psychoanalytic, that these types of delusions are playing some sort of emotional role for the agent, right? So he may feel guilt or some other distress, and the way that the term I sometimes use is square away. Well, where are these emotions coming from? Well, it must have been from this bad thing that I did. And I think guilt and delusions are similar in this way, that they benefit, they're resolved by confession. And I think this is, part of the reason why people with delusions are so ready to express them, because it's this kind of confession that captures the emotional role that they're playing. So, in the same way, right, like if this delusion that I've beat up my mother and locked her in the basement is motivated not by any evidence that I've done so, but from this emotional factor, from this distress factor. It's not going to be amenable to counter evidence. So that's like the first, to an approximation. That's the first move. The second move is belief compartmentalization. And there's a little bit of modularity here, which is to say, if you buy into this, but you don't buy into this compartmentalization scheme, I'm hoping that I'm still giving the beginnings of a tool to explain evidence resistance, but I think that we can use this implicit and explicit compartmentalization to make sense of double bookkeeping and to maybe a sharper extent evidence resistance. So at first I had used completely different terms for implicit and explicit because I didn't think these words fully captured what I have in mind, but then I realized it's probably better to, in some ways, to rely on some folk terms rather than engineer completely new ones. So there are, like, common examples of implicit and explicit beliefs. One of these that comes up often is implicit racism or implicit sexism. So for example, I may be in conversations and in arguments, if someone says women are inferior to men, I would be completely willing and readily argue against that and say, no, women are capable of all the things that men are. Women are not unequal to men. But let's say I'm grading philosophy papers and the author names are not blinded to me. And if I know that the author is a woman, I tend to grade the papers harsher. So these things that seem to suggest that even though explicitly I believe one thing, my behavior, my unreflective action seems to suggest quite another. And that if I were grading these papers when the author names were blinded and I didn't know the gender of the author, I would grade them similarly, or with the same level of harshness or critical critique, then that might suggest that I have some kind of implicit sexist belief. And I think we have these a lot. These are carved up, not carved up, these are described in a lot of different ways. So Tamar Gendler at Yale talks about aleefs versus beliefs. And aleefs kind of explain, if you were given a piece of chocolate that was shaped in the shape of feces, why you might be averse to it, even though you know that it's chocolate, because there's this unreflective, deeper level that an aleef is working at rather than a belief. Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow talks about type 1 versus type 2 thinking. So again, right, like I don't think that you have to use the words implicit and explicit to get the work done here. But those are the words that I'm using for now. And the thought is implicit beliefs are those that are shown through our unreflective action. We have them because they reduce our cognitive load. They're things that we don't have to be thinking about all the time. We don't have to reason and argue to get to them. And I also tentatively say that I think they're more sensitive to these non-evidential considerations or motivations. I'm going to twist that around a little bit later. But by contrast, the explicit beliefs are those that I usually may achieve through reasoning, and I'm willing to defend an argument. So now, if we accept, okay, I can believe P explicitly, but not P implicitly, we can apply this framework onto delusions and maybe get a lot of explanatory power here. So in the bottom, I have basically all the permutations that you can have, which could have been expressed by yet another 2x2 matrix, but I guess I decided not to do that again. But you can, if you discuss at an explicit or an implicit level, what belief do I hold, either the delusional one or the orthodox one, how is this delusion likely to behave? So, for example, if I implicitly, that is, it shows up in unreflective action. Let's say the delusion in question here is that the nurses are trying to poison me. if I believe that implicitly, it's reflected in my immediate action, and also explicitly, when you talk to me, I express to you that I think the nurses are trying to poison me. We get non-double bookkeeping delusional states, which are the ones of, okay, well, I'm going to tell you that I think the nurses are poisoning me, and I also am not going to eat the food that they give me. Now, this OD state, and I describe this as the implicit one is first and the explicit one is second. So if I implicitly believe the orthodox belief, which is nurses are not trying to poison me, but explicitly what I hold is the delusional belief. So this is kind of like a reverse of the implicit sexist belief, right? Where the rational one, or quote unquote, the orthodox one is held implicitly, and the delusional or irrational or whatever one is held explicitly. We get the double bookkeeping state. And then there are other states, and in the paper itself, I dive a little bit into how I think an agent might move between them, because that's something else. Like when it comes to the process of therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy to help people with delusions, it seems like there's reality testing and some degree of maybe just Socratic reasoning that is sometimes helpful, but not all the times helpful. And I think this could be captured or explained based on these delusion configurations. So because I know I'm running out of time a little bit, so this is basically the last content slide. And the question here is, well, why should we do this? Kind of going back to the beginning, there are anti or non-doxastists who think, okay, these double bookkeeping and evidence resistance worries are devastating to the doxastic account, and we should get rid of them because there are so many other things other than just the epistemic level or the evidential level that delusions are functioning at. And if we open up our understanding of beliefs, we actually can accommodate these features. We can accommodate why people don't why people with delusions may not always act as though they're true, but sometimes they will. And why evidence resistance also occurs, which we would maybe not ordinarily be able to explain with the traditional doxastic view. And then we also get to keep, by keeping the doxastic view, some of the really attractive features of the doxastic view, which is why delusions are sometimes used as premises and further reasoning, as compared to, say, the empty speech act model of delusions, why these seem to be held with conviction and they seem to bother the agent, be so central in the sorts of ways that beliefs are. So these are some of the references that I had. I think I ended right around 25 minutes, hopefully. So thank you. And then I guess I will open this up for questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Raj, so much for the talk. Questions, comments? You can raise your hand. Sebas?
Hi, Russ. Thanks for your talk. In the model you propose, would you dissociate the explicit and the implicit? Makes me wonder whether you have any evidence. Logically, I can think of that, no problem. So with it was called the double bookkeeping case, which is the analogous to the implicit bias. But I was wondering whether there is any evidence of such a case and any actual case. And that seems to be relevant because you seem to assume, so your taxonomy seems to assume that they can be doubly dissociated. So we have like two different processes, one explicit, one implicit, and there is no dependence on them. That might happen, for example, in perception, but in the case of belief, the case that you were proposing seems a little bit odd, and I was wondering whether there is any evidence or any case where you could illustrate this case. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. So I think the empirical literature on these two different processes is admittedly a little hazy. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman writes a little bit about how he thinks, like what he thinks is type 1 versus type 2 thinking. He thinks of them as different circuits. And he seems to think that there are reasons why we should think of these systems as unrelated. But when it comes to, beliefs which have content, which an agent, takes to be the case or a way of representing the world, the interplay between them is, I will admit, like very hazy to me. So I don't, at an intuitive level, I think that they may be related in some ways. Like there are ways that people through practice revise their implicit sexist beliefs. But like from like an empirical evidence standpoint, I have not a lot to say on that. All I have really is just reflecting on sort of the things that other people have written about implicit beliefs, and yeah, so thank you for that.
Well, maybe just a quick follow-up. Can I?
Yeah.
I look at Federico always. Just a very quick follow-up. So then could you please tell me a little bit more about why do you think that your theoretical proposal it's neutral on actual realization? So whether, I mean, that you give a theoretical tool, and I was wondering whether this is neutral on the actual architecture of our cognition. So if it is not, then we should find some evidence of this dissociation. If it is, it's not clear to me why. I don't know whether that helps. So I'm just trying to add some pressure on your commitments to there actually being that's an architecture in beings like us.
So sorry, neutral with respect to whether or not there is this type of architecture. Yeah, so yeah, I don't think my view is neutral to whether or not there is this kind of architecture. I think my view is that there is. And I think that's manifested in things like implicitly held beliefs, like implicit sexist beliefs and things like that. And the work that I have to do when I go back to this is but find an empiric basis for that of other than just the theoretical work that the model allows us to do, why we should think that we have implicit and explicit compartments. There's been some philosophical work on this, like David Lewis writes on fragmentation, which is very similar to compartmentalization. And he uses examples about railroads and roads and similar things to show that we seem to have fragmented beliefs. But beyond that, like original empiric work, that's something that I have to look at.
So we'll wait for questions. So I was having in mind precisely the case of fragmentation, because the case of fragmentation seems to be different from the kind of dissociation that I was reading in the presentation, where you have something like system 1 and system 2, which are isolated, something along this line. So fragmentations in the way in which I was reading the further development of fragmentation, so in the work by Rayo, etc., or Adam Elga, etc., the kind of architecture seems different from this one, where you have like this, they are related in a different way and not helping them in this isolated way. And that's what my question comes from. I don't know, that might be helpful.
I see. Okay. I see what you mean. Yes, I'm gonna think on that. Thank you.
Anyone else? Maybe I could insert a question myself. I was curious, Raj, about the possibility of giving a hinge account of delusions that you mentioned in passing, and that was meant to be an alternative to a doxastic account. So I wonder how that relates to the sort of view that you're putting forward.
Yeah. So the hinge view of delusions has, been accepted primarily, at least to my understanding, because it allows us to make sense of why they're resistant to evidence. So hinges, for example, if anyone doesn't know, these are the sorts of commitments that someone may hold, like, I have two hands, and they're the sorts of things that Wittgenstein says by convention are not doubted. And that seems to take, maybe at first glance, a form that delusions may as well. That delusions are the sorts of things that are by convention not doubted. Because if I were to doubt that I had two hands, why should I think anything at all? The grounds for doubting rest on certainty is to an approximation the thought there. So I think that delusions are not hinges because, at least as Wittgenstein describes them, hinges play a different role in reasoning. So whereas hinges are supposed to be the basis, they're the sorts of things that make reasoning possible. They make inquiry possible, sorry. They are the door is inquiry on which these hinges rest. Delusions seem to not play that role, at least in my mind. It seems like they're the consequence of certain types of processes. I take these as like the emotional ones, the like distress level things that end up culminating in a delusion. My mentor here, Duncan Pritchard, just is writing a paper, and he has a different view. His is that hinges are in accordance with our more widely held beliefs. So, the belief, the hinge that I have two hands is compatible with everything else that I believe. One, that the world didn't just come into existence 4 seconds ago, that I am not an invalid brain, all of those sorts of things. And his view is that, well, then delusions can't be hinges, because delusions do, at least at first phase, conflict with the wider held beliefs of an agent. So, for example, if I have the delusion that I'm dead, I also, or so his argument goes, I also believe that dead people don't walk, talk, or speak. Walk, talk, or breathe. But here I am doing all of those things, and because there's that contradiction, a delusion can't be a hinge. So that's his thought. My thought is more about the role that hinges play in inquiry that delusions seem to not play, but still nascent.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. We have one more question. Andrea?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering why emotions are not evidence for delusions, or are unconscious emotions or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So in short, I think it comes, okay, in shorter, I'm not too sure, but in short, what I think is it's about basing. I think an emotion is not the right kind of reason to develop a specific belief about something. So like, for example, one of the thoughts behind Capgras delusion, the delusion that all of my loved ones have been replaced with identical imposters or robots. One of the early thoughts on this was the part of the right parietal lobe in the brain that, or left parietal lobe, one of them, that feels the emotion of warmth or joy or love whenever you see a loved one, that part was not functioning correctly, and that played a causal role in forming the delusion, right? So the person would take, oh, I don't feel the same love and happiness that I usually do when I see this person. So I take that as evidence for the belief that they've been replaced by an identical imposter. So some commentators have pushed back on that view as saying that the emotion serves as evidence, because it's not clear why that particular belief is privileged over, say, any other conclusion that might come from evidence. So, for example, one might be, I have evidence that I have a brain lesion that's leading me to not feel the same types of feelings that I have when I look at my loved ones. So that, then I use my lack of feeling as evidence for I have this neurological problem, right? That seems to be like a clearer evidential connection to go from that, oh, this feeling that I have is evidence for this brain condition that I have. The evidence seemed to suggest, rather than my loved ones have been replaced by imposters, that I have some kind of psychiatric or neurological problem. Or we'll just go with neurological for now, because you can get delusions from like a stroke to this brain region. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, but there's because that doesn't happen, some people have thought that if emotions are being used as evidence, they're being used so inappropriately that we should really, really, really doubt or question whether or not it's evidence in the way that we'd usually think of it. That's what some people say. I don't know that I completely subscribe to that or exactly what my thoughts are. So that is a good question, and thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you.
So I think that's it for now. Raj, thank you so much for the talk and the discussion. So we're a bit behind our schedule, so we're gonna do a short break now, and then let's say 15 minutes from now. That's roughly well, it depends on where you are. 2 o'clock. We'll reconvene, and then we'll have Richard Hassel's talk, and then my own. And I didn't mention this at the outset, but Aisha Quados, who was going to be giving the last talk, she won't be able to attend due to personal issues. So we'll be wrapping up today a little bit earlier. So let's take a short break, and we'll meet in roughly 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to go on?
Right, I need to screen share, don't I?
Yeah.
I don't-
I'll record again, so you're here. Okay. You should be able, Richard, to share your screen.
Right, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
Okay. We'll wait.
Uh,
So I'll present you. We are continuing with our last session today with Richard Hassel and his work titled Hermeneutical Injustice as a Consequence of Receiving a Psychiatric Diagnosis.
now I'm having difficulty doing the screen share.
Okay, do you want to send me or Federico your PowerPoint presentation? Or
Yes,
is that
I'll do
more
that.
difficult?
Yep. Let me see how I do that. Just a moment. Who do I email it to?
You can send it to me here at the user is Sadaf. Through the, if you want, through Zoom or through, or you want an email address.
I've got the email up now. Yes.
Okay.
Who do I email?
I'm writing the email address here.
Otherwise, Richard, you could send it to me.
Yes.
You already have my email address.
Okay. That's
I'll do that. I'll do Federico. Yeah, right. I'll do that now then. Just bear with me. Right, it's just loading. Okay, I've just sent it now. Does that come through?
Not seeing it right. Oh, okay, I got it.
You got it right.
Just give me a minute. And Andre, am I allowed to share my screen?
Yeah, you're supposed to.
Okay.
Can you?
I think I need to open up the file first. Good.
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Right. Am I able to move it on, or do you have to do that, Federico?
I wonder if there is a way for you to take control of it. But otherwise, I'll be happy to do it if you want.
Yes. Okay. Perhaps that'll be simpler then, if I just tell you when to move on.
Yes, please.
Okay. So shall I start then? Everyone can see that? Right. Okay. So my title is Hermeneutical Injustice as a Consequence of Getting a Psychiatric Diagnosis. This is based on my PhD thesis, which I finished last year. So it's taken really from the last two chapters of that. Okay, if you can move on, Federico, next one. Right, thanks. So this is the structure of my talk. I'm going to start by make just a few slides about talking about the what a diagnosis means, a psychiatric diagnosis means to people who receive it. Then I'm going to go on to talk about narrativity, because that's a key element in my thesis here, about the importance of self-narratives in people's lives. And I'll spend a bit of time talking particularly about a couple of theorists who I read quite a lot of, so Jerome Bruner and Ian McIntyre. And I'll talk also about how psychiatric diagnosis may have an impact on someone's self-diagnosis. I'm then going to go on to talk about epistemic injustice and say what that is and how it can arise in medical and psychiatric contexts. I'm then going to talk about how hermeneutical injustice in particular can arise after a psychiatric diagnosis, and then I'll just briefly summarize. So next one, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the meaning of a diagnosis now. So next one, please, Erika. Okay, what does a psychiatric diagnosis mean for the recipient, the person who receives it? There are some interesting comments on this. About 5 years ago, there was a short video clip posted on the BBC website in the UK entitled "How Does Your Diagnosis Make You Feel?" It's about a 10-minute video sequence in which a number of mental health service users were asked about their diagnosis and what they felt about it. So one says, "I hate my diagnosis. The main one I have is borderline personality disorder, and I hate it with a passion. People start seeing you differently." Someone else talks more positively about a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and he says, "People suddenly realized I wasn't doing things for attention. It was because I have a brain disorder." And as I said, there's a range of different responses to having a diagnosis. So some people welcome a diagnosis, others find it oppressive and feel that it imposes some kind of alien narrative for their experiences. So I'll really be talking more about the latter group of people for whom the diagnosis is not so welcome. And I'm going to argue that in these cases, people can become victims of epistemic injustice. Okay, Federico, next one. Right, thanks. So generally, people with emotional distress and mental disorders are likely to find themselves in what might be called an epistemic predicament. This is something that's talked about by Ian Kidd and Harvey Carell. They talk about the epistemic predicament that patients generally, not just psychiatric patients, but medical patients generally can feel themselves in. The problem of trying to make sense of their mental state. So possibly this could be a state they could find themselves in of self-illness ambiguity, along the lines we were talking about yesterday. To receive a diagnosis is to be told something important about oneself. And obviously this depends upon the severity of the condition, whether it's a very mild disease or whether it's something serious. But certainly it's an important piece of information about oneself. So the question in my mind really is, what sense does the individual make of their diagnosis? Does it explain their illness in some way? And of course, in general medicine, the diagnosis has usually in fact, has an important explanatory function. And does the diagnosis itself make their experience of their feeling even worse? And of course, that can happen, particularly if a diagnosis suggests a limited prospect for recovery from the illness. Okay, next one. So, psychiatric diagnoses, of course, are given in a medicalized environment. And psychiatry, of course, is a branch of medicine. In general medicine, somatic medicine, diagnoses are generally understood, although there are a few exceptions, but generally understood to convey some kind of explanatory information. So it's an explanation for the clinician to understand how the condition developed and what to do about it, and also for the patient. It gives the patient some level of understanding as well. It's given by someone with epistemic authority, a doctor. So the training and the qualifications of the doctor is what gives them the epistemic authority and what makes the diagnosis itself something authoritative. So you can't really diagnose yourself because you haven't got the training and qualifications to do so. And diagnosis in medicine is linked with the disease, with the concept of disease specificity. That's the notion that diagnosis names a disease entity of some kind, and differential diagnosis refers to a process where the clinician is trying to distinguish between two or three possible diagnoses or 2 or 3 possible diseases that the patient might have. People receiving a psychiatric diagnosis are often encouraged to think of their condition as, quote, an illness like any other, or a disease like any other even. And I'm arguing that this can lead them to have a biomedical narrative about their condition. Okay, next one. So on to self-narratives then. Right, next slide, please. So I'm interested in self-narratives. This was a key chapter in my thesis. Many philosophers, some psychologists as well, have given quite detailed accounts of narrativity. A lot of narrative theorists in philosophy. So people like, well, Bruner's psychologist, of course, Jerome Bruner, but McIntyre, Charles Taylor, Maria Scheckman, Daniel Dennett, Paul Ricoeur, and others. The overarching themes across all these, really, all these theorists, is that narratives are an important means by which we make sense of our lives and all the events that happen to us. They define for ourselves who we are, why we do what we do, and they give our lives meaning. And they also, of course, give our lives a direction as well. So they give us a sense of where we think we're going, where we want to go, where we think we're going. Thank you. So Bruner, first of all, he gives a very good account of his theory in his book, Acts of Meaning. He views narratives, self-narratives, as a kind of autobiography. I think these are his words, really, an account given by a narrator who's also the protagonist. It's a story terminating in the present when the narrator and the protagonist come together. And she says, a narrative is composed of a unique sequence of events, mental states, happenings involving human beings as characters or actors. These are its constituents. But these constituents do not have a life or meaning of their own. Their meaning is given by their place in the overall configuration of the sequence as a whole, its plot or fabula. And Bruner also just adds as well that the narratives don't have to have the kind of literary elegance or the kind of aesthetic elegance of the work of literature. They can be quite disorganized sometimes, and certainly not an aesthetic work of art. And the acquisition of self-narratives begins in early childhood, when parents and carers start to tell the young child what they're doing and what's going on, and that can form the basis of narratives. Okay, next one. Bruner points out that the narrative does more than just recite a chronology of events. It expresses a larger purpose and moral framework. And so he says that in autobiography, the story reveals a strong rhetorical strand, as if justifying why it was necessary, not causally, but morally, socially, psychologically, that the life had gone a particular way. The self, as narrator, not only recounts, but justifies. And the story that the narrator develops is always open to reinterpretation for subsequent telling, and that can be telling either to other people or to oneself. And these reinterpretations or retellings can be in response to ongoing events, some of which might be quite major. Okay, next. Another narrative theorist who I think is important is Alistair McIntyre. This is taken from his book After Virtue. And he says a central thesis is that man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. And incidentally, that also reflects work by the philosopher Charles Taylor, who in one of his papers is called Self-Interpreting Animals. So Taylor regards human beings as animals who have a basic need to self-interpret themselves. So McIntyre puts his emphasis on intelligibility. He says the concept of an intelligible action is a more fundamental concept than that of an action as such. Actions become intelligible by virtue of their place in the narrative, and we understand their own lives in terms of narratives we have of ourselves. Okay, next one, please. Yeah. McIntyre also points out about how we enter into a set of stories as children, as young children. So we enter human society with one or more imputed stories, roles into which we have been drafted. We need to learn these roles if we're to understand how others relate to us and what expectations are placed on us. And of course, we're constrained in the narratives we construct for ourselves by the settings we're in and the narratives that others have of us. So we're co-authors of our narratives. And I'm going to argue that receiving a medical or psychiatric diagnosis, well, in my case, particularly psychiatric diagnosis, is an event that can force a change in one's self-narrative. Okay, next, please. So one's self-narrative can be changed by receiving psychiatric diagnosis, and I think very often is. These diagnoses are frequently understood by the recipient in terms of a biomedical model of disorder. So the diagnosis may suggest a neurochemical disturbance of some kind. And the quote I gave at the beginning of this talk about the individual welcoming his diagnosis of bipolar disorder indicates that he understood the diagnosis as meaning that he had some kind of brain disturbance. So some diagnoses may distort or discount the individual's previous narratives or change their self-conceptions. And this can be particularly reinforced, I think, by the medicalized nature of the environment in which the diagnostic assessment is carried out. This can suggest also a biomedical narrative to the patient. Okay, next one, please. Thank you, Roy. So this relates to the psychiatric interview itself. And there's an interesting paper, I think, by Giovanni Stangolini. His paper is called The Puzzle of the Psychiatric Interview. And he writes, the meaning of a symptom is reduced to properties that correspond to one category. There is little space for personal meanings and personal narratives. And by this he means the meaning of the symptom in relation to the DSM or ICD category that the clinician is attempting to settle on. And of course, having a reliable diagnosis is fundamental now to the DSM and ICD. Of course, from DSM-3 onwards, the drive of the American Psychiatric Association was to develop reliable diagnostic categories such that two different clinicians would be likely to reach the same diagnosis when assessing the same individual. In order to do that, there needs to be a clear specification of the symptoms that make up the criteria for the diagnostic category. So therefore, there needs to be a standardized interview in order to achieve reliability. Without the interview being done in a standardized way, the chances of attaining a reliable diagnosis become less. So the interview becomes symptom-oriented. The individual is treated as a source of data, and therefore the way in which the interview is carried out can reinforce the biomedical narrative. And I want to argue that this kind of process can contribute to epistemic injustice, particularly hermeneutical injustice. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so moving on to epistemic injustice itself. If we can move on again, next, please. Next, please, Federico, thank you. So this is taken, of course, from Miranda Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. And as she describes it, this concerns the ethical dimension of our epistemic endeavors, those of knowing, reasoning, giving testimony, interpreting experience. And it's a harm done to someone in their capacity as an epistemic agent. It's generated by some kind of negative identity prejudice towards the victim of the injustice. And epistemic injustice occurs, I think, well, it occurs in context of a power imbalance. And this is an important element in Fricke's conception of epistemic injustice. It's actually part of a subtitle of the book itself. And the first section of the first chapter talks about power as well in human relationships. Okay, next one, please. Thank you. So she describes two kinds of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice, in which the credibility given to an individual due to a negative identity prejudicial stereotype is in some ways deflated. The individual may have their credibility undermined when they give testimony. And a sort of frequent example of this is shown, and there have been quite a lot of recorded instances of this, of Black people giving testimony to the police, or just telling police about crimes they may have witnessed. There was a notorious one in London about 30 years ago when a young Black man was murdered. His friend, another Black man, gave the police a very good description of what had happened, but the police disregarded his testimony because he was Black. The other kind of injustice, of course, is hermeneutical injustice, and this refers to a marginalization of one's social experience due to a structural identity prejudice. And it arises, in Fricke's terms anyway, it arises where one's hermeneutical resources for understanding or interpreting one's experiences are impaired or absent in some respect. And an example she gives is of a woman in America, in the USA, in I think the 1970s, thereabouts, who suffered persistent sexual harassment from her job, and eventually she felt forced to resign from her employment. But this was before the term sexual harassment had actually entered common vocabulary. And she went to women's groups, and other women of the same groups came up with the same sorts of experiences, and together jointly they came up with the term sexual harassment. But before that term was introduced, she lacked the conceptual resources to really describe her experiences adequately. Okay, and next one, please. So, as I say, in Fricke's terms, refers to hermeneutical injustice, refers to cases where individuals lack the conceptual resources to understand their situation. But it can also refer to cases where the victim actually possesses adequate hermeneutical resources, an adequate conceptual repertoire, but these are marginalized in some way. And this is discussed by, among others, Rebecca Mason and Jose Medina. Rebecca Mason refers to dominant and non-dominant hermeneutical resources. So people who are oppressed, for example, may well have quite good hermeneutical resources for understanding their predicament, understanding their situation, but the society in which they're living doesn't recognize them. The dominant social groups don't recognize those resources and don't respond to them. So people may therefore find their hermeneutical resources being marginalized by more dominant social groups. Okay, next one, please. So epistemic injustice can occur in medical contexts. And Harvey Carell and Ian Kidd have written about this. They've written a number of papers about this. It can occur in medical contexts, not necessarily, of course. I'm not saying it happens, or they're not saying it happens a lot of the time, but it can occur quite frequently. A key factor in this is the vulnerability of patients due to power imbalance between them and the healthcare system. And you've only got to go to your doctor with quite a mild complaint and sit in the chair while the doctor interviews you, and then you can feel straight away there's a difference in power between you. You're dependent on the doctor to help you out in some way or other. So, of course, the medical profession takes typically a biomedical approach to illness, rather than a more phenomenological approach. And this can lead to the patient's experience being, the patient's subjective experience being marginalized. Another factor that can impact on this are the structures and contingencies of healthcare systems. And this is particularly evident where there are significant resource limitations in the healthcare system, where the staff are under stress, where there are time and cost pressures, etc. And that's a time when staff may feel they have to cut corners. They can't listen to the patient adequately. So again, that can generate epistemic injustice. The authority and the epistemic privilege of doctors and other clinicians is important here because, of course, the medical profession and others are trained, have qualifications, which is what gives them the epistemic privilege. They have the power to define concepts of disease and the power of decision to treat and control treatment access. And of course, all these issues apply in mental health contexts. And certainly in the UK mental health environment at the moment, from what I'm hearing, that mental health practitioners are working under extreme stress at the moment with very poor resources. Okay, next one, please. So testimonial injustice in healthcare, in a psychiatric context, then, again, it might be because the individual testimony is devalued because of the possible or hypothesized diagnosis. And there's a very quite amusing example, I think, in a paper by Crichton, Correll and Kidd, and they report, when one of the authors was a medical student in Munich, Germany. He saw a young man on an acute psychiatric ward who said he was a relative of the then Soviet leader. The responsible consultant took this to be a grandiose delusion and therefore as evidence of a psychotic delusion, but it later turned out to be true. And there are other examples in the literature. So a paper which I've mentioned there, Sonati and Kiratsus also has examples of that kind of thing. Okay, next please, thank you. Okay, so on to hermeneutical injustice after a psychiatric diagnosis. Next please. How might the psychiatric diagnosis affect an individual? Well, one philosopher who's written about this is Sharifa Tekin, and she has quite a long paper, 2011. She writes, and she talks about how the psychiatric diagnosis can often imply a biomedical narrative. She says such as biomedical narrative may prevent the subject from developing adaptive, cognitive, affective and social responses to her condition. Considering her psychological state merely a function of unbalanced brain chemistry, divorced from the environmental, social and cultural context, may lead her to question the perceived reality of her disturbed psychological states, thereby diminishing her self-respect and feelings of agency. So although Tekin doesn't actually talk about epistemic injustice specifically at all, at least not in that paper, this seems to me to be quite a good description of how hermeneutical injustice can arise. So where the individual's psychological state may not be seen as something meaningful even to herself. Instead, it may be assumed or accepted to be a consequence of some kind of neurochemical process which she feels is beyond her control, and it may therefore induce feelings of hopelessness about recovery. Okay, next one, please. So what I'm arguing, I suppose this is the main part of my argument really, the narrative of a neurochemical abnormality underlying the patient's mental disturbance is often conveyed by clinicians in mental health services, and this can have the effect of marginalizing the patient's own narrative. The patient may feel unable to communicate her own understanding to the professional network around her. She may actually be able to describe her experience in fairly clear terms to other people, but not in the kind of expert language or terminology that the professionals treating her will really take notice of. So her description may not be taken up by the professional audience and may play little role in clinical decision making. and her own emotional distress, because of course, if she's suffering from a mental disorder, she's going to be unhappy, distressed, depressed, maybe delusional, a lot of symptoms. This, I think, is very likely to reduce her confidence generally, and very likely her confidence in her own hermeneutical resources, her own conceptual resources, and in her ability to express her understanding, even where she has some sense of what she's going through and can say so, she may not feel confident in expressing that to the professional community treating her. So I think in this way, she may become a victim of hermeneutical injustice. Okay, next one, please, Federico. A short paper in a short paper, Anastasia Scrutton talks about how hermeneutical injustice can arise in the context of a psychiatric diagnosis. She says, again, I think reflecting what I said earlier about how Giovanni Stangolini conceptualizes the psychiatric interview. So she agrees with him, in effect, that individuals can be treated as sources of data rather than actual participants in the diagnostic process. And again, their reported experiences can be interpreted as symptoms of a diagnostic category, with other aspects of the person's experience being discounted. And she says, unlike paradigmatic forms of hermeneutical injustice, here it's not the case that an experience is not understood at all on account of the absence of valid interpretation for it. Rather, one valid perspective is dominant and exclusive, giving rise to a one-sided interpretation. And she references the paper by Rebecca Mason there to back that up. Okay, next one, please, Federico. So there are a number of personal reports from service users and ex-service users in the literature, and I've put quite a number of those in my thesis. I've just included two here. So the first of these is from Jackie Dillon, who is now a campaigner on behalf of mental health service users in the UK, having previously been a user of psychiatric services in the past. So she talks about her experience in mental health services. She says, the clear message I received was that I was ill. Everything that I said and did was caused by my illness. The abuse never happened. Even thinking it did was part of my illness. The fact that I didn't want to take medication was because I was ill. If I wanted to get better, I must accept my diagnosis and take medication. I would always have this illness. I wouldn't be able to work. I didn't know what was best for me. I lacked insight. And just in passing, not only, I think this is a good example of hermeneutical injustice, but also, of course, an example of testimonial injustice as well. She's also talked in her work about how she suffered quite severe sexual abuse when she was a child. And of course, as she's saying in this excerpt here, the psychiatrist who interviewed her dismissed what she said about it and told her that it never happened. Thinking that it did was part of her illness. Okay, next one, please. Federico, please, thank you. And this one from Patricia Deegan, who I think is now a clinical psychologist in the USA, and I think also campaigns to some extent on behalf of mental health service users. And she also, in her earlier on, I think when she was in her late teens or early adulthood, was a user of psychiatric services. She says, my psychiatrist told me I had chronic schizophrenia. He said I would be sick for the rest of my life, and the best I could do was avoid stress and cope. Something in me fought back against his prognosis of doom. As I stood outside his office, I remember rejecting the chronic mental patient life plan and thinking, I will become Dr. Deegan and then I will change the mental health system. So I think in both these cases, this one and the one I just mentioned by Jackie Dillon, they both indicate people who were told in effect that they had something that was going to be chronic long, that they wouldn't really have much chance of recovering from. They were given a very strong biomedical message about the nature of their condition. And I think as such, they were both victims of hermeneutical injustice. Of course, what they also have in common, of course, is they were both able to resist that and to fight against it. And I think this quote by Patricia Deegan almost describes the point at which she decided to reject the diagnosis. Okay, next one, please. Federico. So, in conclusion, I'm arguing making sense of one's predicament and communicating one's thoughts and feelings to others when one is ill is important in aiding recovery. And I think that's axiomatic. I haven't really presented any argument for that. I just think it's pretty much intuitive. And self-narratives are an important means by which people can do this to help aid one's recovery. One needs to have something about your self-narrative that gives you the confidence that you can get better. Individuals may be vulnerable to experiences of epistemic injustice in healthcare contexts. A particular case, I think, in mental health contexts where hermeneutical injustice may also be experienced. Where experiences of hermeneutical injustice arise, then the diagnosis can be a key element in their occurrence. And experiences of hermeneutical injustice are mediated by the biomedical narrative with which a diagnosis is associated. So those are my conclusions, basically. I did consider whether to add into the talk, although I thought it was probably long enough anyway, a brief description of other cases to other frameworks for assessment, such as case formulation, or in Britain now what's becoming popular is the power of threat meaning framework from some psychologists. And I want to just add that none of this implies that a diagnosis should not be given, and that if the individual wants a diagnosis, then it can be given. Really trying to say that that is better done when what the diagnosis means is explained clearly to the patient, what it means and what it doesn't mean, and particularly that it doesn't mean necessarily that the condition they have is a chronic one. Okay, that's it. So on the next slide, if you want to look at it, there's a list of my references, but that's basically the substance of the talk anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Very, very interesting talk. And now we have a few minutes for questions. You can raise your hand. Yes, Yafen.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really enjoyed it. So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that upon receiving a diagnosis, there can be two kinds of cases where some people find the diagnosis liberating, some people find it more oppressive, and you're saying that you're going to focus on the latter kind of cases, and at least some of the latter cases, they can be epistemic injustice. My question really concerns the comparison between those cases where they're arguably not cases of epistemic injustice and those cases where they are. And I'm wondering what's the, let's say, structural difference between those cases, right? Sometimes even for the same diagnosis, maybe some patients kind of embrace it, find it liberating, and some people find it oppressive. Are there, like, what's differential, like what makes the latter kind of cases, what gives rise to epistemic injustice in the latter cases that does not give rise to epistemic injustice in the first kind of cases? That's my question.
Right, thank you for that. You're touching on an issue that I thought about and decided I didn't. I mean, I thought about it when I was writing my whole thesis, and decided that I really couldn't tackle all that. So possibly one could be arguing that even the cases of the people who welcome their diagnosis might also be victims of epistemic injustice. And so I took it that part of what you're thinking. Am I right about that? I think that's a much more difficult thesis to argue for, and maybe it's one for the future. I suppose it's tempting, in order to present the thesis in this way, I've sort of drawn a distinction between people who welcome a diagnosis on one hand and people on the others who don't, and maybe, but maybe it's more of a continuum rather than a either or, rather than being entirely black and white. There's also there isn't any systematic evidence that I'm aware of, but anecdotally I think there might be, and certainly in my reading of the literature of one problem is that the epistemic injustice is not the kind of thing that can be measured in the same way that lots of psychological variables can be measured empirically. And every user of mental health services has a different story to tell. So the research on this is almost entirely qualitative. I'm not aware of any quantitative research into people's reactions to a diagnosis. So one has to draw one's conclusions from what there is in the qualitative research literature. So part of the sense I'm getting is that it depends to some extent on the diagnosis. The one I mentioned at the start was a man who was given the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and he said he hates his diagnosis, and that seems to be common with that kind of diagnosis. And schizophrenia is another one which seems to be one that many people have difficulty living with, have difficulty thinking of themselves as someone with schizophrenia. So I think in part it may be to do with the actual diagnosis, and I think that's probably a subject that needs further empirical research, actually. Certainly, again, anecdotally, I get the sense that people with diagnosis of bipolar disorder don't find that as negative or as oppressive as those other diagnoses. So I get, but yeah, I think it's something that needs further empirical research, and I hope someone will do that at some point. Is that okay? Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Roy?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Richard. I think I agreed with most of what you presented. I think I have a question about the emphasis that you put on the biomedical narratives contributing to hermeneutical injustice. And I was wondering whether it's really the sort of biomedical element that is problematic there, or whether it's the sort of reductionist component of the biomedical narrative, in the sense that wouldn't any narrative that is reductionistic in any way be contributing to the hermeneutic injustice in the way that you showed? Or do you think that it's specifically a problem for the biomedical angle?
I haven't really thought about this. I mean, it would seem to me that any account like that, which any reductionist account is I would have thought is likely to be biomedical, because I'm not sure what other type of account could be reductionist apart from a biomedical one.
Well, if someone would say that someone who is depressed should just, someone who is depressed and they reduce it to just stress at work, something like that.
Right. Now, I mentioned very briefly right at the end the power, threat, meaning framework. I don't know if people have heard of that. It's an initiative by several psychologists in Britain about 10 years ago, and it's I know it's being used a lot in some parts of the UK, and I know it's been translated into Spanish, so it may well have. So it's obviously taken some hold in the Spanish-speaking world as well. So that could be a framework in which that sort of reductionist account could happen, I suppose. My guess is that the individual themselves might feel they might account for their own depression by saying, I'm depressed because of my stress at work, because of all the shit that the manager is giving me. I think another approach, of course, is case formulation. And case formulations really are, when they're done properly, should be done they should be co-constructed with the individual so that the formulation makes sense to the individual herself or himself. So I don't see if that's incorporating social and psychological and maybe other environmental factors going on, then I wouldn't have described that as reductionist specifically. I tend to think about reductionism as being a particular way of doing science, philosophy of science, really. The notion that one level explanation can be reduced to more simple forms of explanation, to another level of explanation, or another level of conceptual vocabulary. But I guess also there's a lot in the literature about biomedical narratives anyway in the medical context. And also from my own professional background, because I used to be a clinical psychologist, so I kind of come across this when I was working professionally as well. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I've probably about as much I can say. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, I think I might have chosen the wrong word by calling it reductionistic. I think I was hinting at this kind of non-holistic view. So any narrative that sort of suggests that there is a very simple explanation, whether it's biological or social or whatever, that any such narrative would be problematic.
I suppose if it's the clinician, the psychiatrist or psychologist or whoever is saying to the patient, you've got this problem because such and such has happened, and disregarding what the individual herself or himself is saying, or disregarding even part of what the service user is saying, then that would constitute epistemic injustice, either testimonial or hermeneutical kind. It would mean that the patient was having his testimony in some way marginalized, or leading him to feel that he wasn't really a full participant in the assessment process. And maybe that's what it boils down to, really. Is the service user a participant in the assessment process, or is he or she just a subject of it? And if he or she is a subject of it, then perhaps that's a situation that can predispose her or him to becoming a victim of epistemic injustice. And I think that's partly what Harvey Correll and Ian Kidd say in their papers about epistemic injustice in healthcare context generally. Does that help? Okay.
Agos?
Thanks, Richard, for your talk. It was very interesting. And I was wondering about the diagnostic procedure. I have an intuitive idea which seems to contradict to some extent what you were presenting, but at the same time, I'm sure that there's a way to make it compatible. I mean, I'm pretty sure that what I'm going to say is compatible with what you were telling us, but I insist intuitively there's some kind of contradiction. And what I was thinking about is maybe the over-reliance that seems to exist in diagnostic processes regarding what the patient, him or herself, explains about him or herself by means of an open interview or by means of standardized tests. I'm thinking, for instance, about the fact that by default and not by reasonable and premeditated decision, only the patient, him or herself, participates in the diagnostic sessions. And there's, for instance, no reliance on other members of the family of the patient or significant persons who are somehow related to the patient. So I insist, I think that apparent that apparent over-reliance on what the patient says about him or herself through an open interview or through the tests is nonetheless compatible with the overabundance of epistemic or testimonial or hermeneutical injustice. But at least in principle, there seems to be some kind of tension there. I don't know if I made my point clear or.
So are you saying really that, I'm not quite sure, are you saying that actually in practice, the assessment interview may well be done in very different ways by different people in different places, and that obviously I could be accused of overgeneralizing in the way I've described it here? So, I mean, I'm aware, for example, I was told not so long ago about psychiatrists in a major London mental health service for South London and Maudsley Trust, which is one of the leading mental health service providers in the country, told about psychiatrists there who actually prefer not to give diagnoses, which surprised me, but I was assured that was the case. So what I would say is that obviously different clinicians do it very differently depending on the pressures on them. Certainly outside these sort of top and very well-resourced mental health services, mental health service providers, others are much less well provided for, under much more stress. And I think in those cases, again, referring back to the Carroll and Kidd paper, where they talk about how a high degree of stress and pressure in services can lead to epistemic injustice, that may be when the corners are cut, when the clinician is under pressure to reach a diagnosis quickly so that she or he can move on to the next patient. So I guess there's a great deal of variety in how different clinicians do it. So does that answer your question, or have I not quite?
Yeah, partly, because yes, certainly there's diversity. There are different mental health services, and there's a considerable variance among them regarding the way in which they perform their diagnostic procedures due to resources in general terms or to their conception of mental disorders in general. There are certainly mental health services in which certain diagnostic manuals are used, but that usage is not necessarily associated with a reductionistic conception of mental disorders, and therefore in those contexts, epistemic injustice would be somehow regulated. But even though I completely agree with what you have just said, my point was that the diagnostic procedure relies on the words of the patient, him or herself.
Yes.
And in some sense, that implies a certain kind of over-reliance on the conception and perception that the patient has about their condition. There is no space, for instance, for people who are close to that person to tell the mental health professional how they conceive the situation of the patient. So I was just trying to point out an apparent, I insist, it is not a real tension, but just an apparent tension between the over-reliance on what the patient says about him or herself and the existence, or at least the possibility of the existence of epistemic injustice from the part of the mental health professional. You mentioned something that might answer at least partially my question. You said that thinking about the patient as a source of data in order to formulate the diagnosis is a form of epistemic injustice in general terms. So even though the professional lets the patient speak about his situation through an open interview or through tests, if the conception of the patient is as a source of data, that implies epistemic injustice because of the way it is framed, right? So I think that partially answers the question I have in mind.
Well, I think the point was, I mean, this stems from the paper by Stangolini, that when the assessment interview is carried out in a certain way, it's not necessarily an open-ended interview process at all, but it's a set of fixed questions which is designed to get a small range of answers from the patient. And it's therefore the problem is not so much what that brings out, but what it fails to bring out, what the patient is not given the opportunity to express by the closed nature, or by maybe not closed, but the more restricted focus of the interview. So it's really what the patient does not get the opportunity to express, and is not. And of course, for patients when they're very distressed, they may not know how to express it in a very clear way anyway. They may only be able to express themselves in a rather muddled sort of way. So that is not necessarily epistemic injustice itself, but it can predispose the patient to becoming a victim of it. Does that make it clear at all? Does that help?
Yes, just to conclude very briefly, yes, of course, I understand your point. Maybe I had in mind diagnostic processes which were more open-ended by means of open interviews without fixed concrete questions, but taking into account that kind of diagnostic process is more common, I completely understand your point.
Okay.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean,
Thank
I think
you.
where those open-ended processes go on, then I think those are much more helpful. But yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Richard, for your talk. Now we have to go on. Thank you. We have to go on and we'll listen to Federico Burman. Can you share? And I'll introduce you. Federico is gonna talk us about this question: is addiction a disease? Fede, whenever you want. Okay. Okay.
So is this working properly?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Andre. So this is a very, very early version of a new paper. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what your reactions are and all the ways in which this may be going wrong. And the actual title of my talk, as you may see, is different from the one that is included in the program. So you should definitely go ahead and complain to the organizers about that. The actual title is The Disorder Status of Addiction, a Challenge for Psychiatric Internalism. Okay. So my main claim is that the internalistic account of dysfunction in the context of addiction fails. So to put it in slightly different ways, the most plausible candidate for a dysfunction in addiction involves dysfunctional ways of interacting with a certain range of environmental conditions. So if we want to pursue the idea that there is in fact a dysfunction in the context of addiction, then we need to go externalistic. That's my main claim. And I think that the point merits attention, because if my argument is sound, then two families of views enjoying wide support in the addiction literature turn out to be incompatible with one another. And those are the views that endorse some version of the two claims that you have on your screen right now. The first one is the dysfunction-based disorder claim. That is the idea that addiction is a disorder on account of possibly among other things involving dysfunction. And the second one is psychiatric internalism, which is the claim that all the facts that go into making a given condition a disorder are individualistic facts pertaining to the people who suffer from that condition. So if my argument is sound and the internalistic account of dysfunction fails, then the conjunction between these two claims is untenable. And the conjunction of these two claims is itself a widely held view in the addiction literature. What is arguably the most popular view in the medical literature, at least, which is the brain disease model, endorses a version of this conjunction. So if this is correct, then a trilemma ensues. Either addiction is not a disorder, or it is a disorder on account of non-dysfunction related considerations, or psychiatric internalism is false. And I take it that most people would want to retain the claim that addiction is a disorder, and also the view that it involves some sort of dysfunction. So if one chooses that way, then my argument means trouble for psychiatric internalism. So the plan for the talk is this. I'll be concerned with a little bit of framing before turning to my main arguments under heading number 4. First, I'll look into the issue of whether addiction, in fact, involves a dysfunction. Then I'll go briefly over the implications of this for disorder status. And then I'll just barely scratch the surface of the internalism-externalism debate. And then I'll turn to my main arguments before I conclude. So, is addictive behavior the result of a dysfunctional process in the first place? I mean, my main claim is that the internalistic account of dysfunction fails, but you may wonder whether we need to think that there is a dysfunction here at all. And I'm putting forward a conditional claim, which is that if addiction involved a dysfunction, then that would need to be accounted for in externalistic terms. And I am stating this in this conditional mode because there is a defensible view which is consistent with the facts, under which there may be no dysfunction, properly speaking, after all. And I'll go back to this in a bit. But in any case, any definitive answer as to whether there is a dysfunction or not would need to rely on a theory of what function and dysfunction are. And that is not something I am attempting to provide here. But still, I am inclined to think that addiction does involve a sort of dysfunction, which then, according to my argument, would call for an externalistic account. So allow me to articulate what I take the intuition here to be. And again, this is not a proper argument. But I think that the intuition can be summarized as follows. There seems to be something off with the behavior of a person who persists in doing something despite an awareness of harmful, self-destructive consequences. This is, as you may recall, a slightly different way of putting what Hannah Pickard calls the puzzle of addiction. And I think that continuing to do something, even in the face of an awareness of harmful consequences, that is suggestive that something has gone awry, that something has gone wrong. But harm here is actually inessential, as you may have dysfunction even if for whatever reason no harm ensues. So what I take to be the core feature or the core intuitive ground for claiming that there may be a dysfunction in addiction is that there is this loss of expectable ability. There is an ability that we expect people to have that is failing to be manifested to some extent in a recurrent manner. And this relates to a very, very widely held claim in the addiction literature, which is that addiction involves impaired ability to control drug-related behavior. And this notion of there being an impairment of control is crucial to make sense of the difference between addiction and behavior issuing from powerful motivation, including non-addictive drug use. And the most plausible construal of this impairment is in dimensional terms, that is, as a matter of degree. So people suffering from addiction experience a very real difficulty to control drug-related behavior, but still addictive behavior is not something like a zombie state or a reflex-like response or a literal inability to do otherwise, but it is still a substantial real difficulty. And this claim that addiction involves this impairment of control is surely the mainstream view in the addiction literature. So I do not make much of an effort to support this claim in this paper or in this talk. And of course, it is not universally held. But still, we can get back to this point at Q&A if you want. So turning to the implications for the issue of disorder status of addiction, one may wonder whether addiction is correctly pictured as a disorder. And that's an interesting question, but it is just not possible to answer that without making some substantive assumptions about the nature of mental disorder. And different theories of mental disorder come up with different candidate disorder-making properties, and there are a few of them in the literature, as you all know. So I'm going for something different here. I'm not attempting to directly address the question about disorder status, but I'm bringing up an issue about how best to think about dysfunction in addiction. And that issue has potential implications on disorder status under a wide range of views, namely all the views that includes some sort of dysfunction criterion at whatever level of description for claiming that something is a mental or a behavioral disorder. On some accounts, dysfunction may be sufficient for disorder, as in most naturalist views, or it may be among a set of different disorder-making features, as in hybrid accounts a la Wakefield, and at least some normativist accounts as well. And for present purposes, it doesn't matter much, I think, whether we take the relevant dysfunction to be describable in value-free terms or as involving in an ineliminable normative dimension. So I'm trying to frame this in a way that is neutral as to what the correct theory of mental disorder is. But if there were no dysfunction in addiction, then that would rule out addiction as a disorder on some theories, but it could still be a disorder under a theory of mental disorder, which does not include a dysfunction criterion. And even if dysfunction is present on some views, if dysfunction is not sufficient for disorder, then that does not directly settle the disorder status issue. So turning briefly to internalism and externalism about mental disorder, the divide between these views hangs on whether extra individual factors play a constitutive role in one's preferred disorder-making properties. So basically, internalism is a view that they do not. So disorder-making properties can be accounted for in individualistic terms. Note that the issue here is what constitutes mental disorder, and it is not the epistemological issue of how we go about identifying disordered individuals. And that's an important difference because virtually everyone acknowledges that at least in the current state of technical knowledge, we can do no other but to rely on personal level, mostly externalistic criteria as to solve the issue of identification or diagnosis. And the brain disease model of mental disorder is the paradigmatic example of an internalistic view, but it is possibly not the only one. But I won't be making this, I won't be pressing that point. The brain disease model is like the prime example of an internalistic view. And then externalism about mental disorder is a view that extra-individual environmental features or circumstances play a constitutive role in disorder status. So this involves some kind of causal constitutive contrast. And as a rough approximation, constitutive can be taken to mean, in this context, at any rate, that if relevant environmental features or circumstances did not play the requisite role, then that wouldn't be a case of mental disorder. So the way that the internalism externalism debate plays out will depend on what one takes the correct disorder making properties to be. But arguably the central iteration of this debate concerns internalistic and externalistic accounts of dysfunction, which is the point I will be focusing on. And the reason for that is that internalistic views are typically coupled with a naturalistic view of mental disorder. So most internalistic views would be framed in a way that only relies on a dysfunction criterion. So if I were to argue that, say, distress needs to be pictured in externalistic claims, that wouldn't be much of a problem for internalistic views, which do not rely on a concept of, on a distress criterion for mental disorder. So the central issue, I believe, concerns the dysfunction. So the internalistic view of dysfunction, this could conceivably play out in a number of different ways, but the best known representative is the brain disease model of addiction. And on this view, the primary dysfunction is located in the inner workings of the brain's reward system. So in the actual paper, I go into some length to give a at least a minimal picture of what this is supposed to mean. Let me just say a couple of quick things for now. In functional terms, the reward system's role is to influence behavior on the basis of the values of rewards, of items that are construed as rewards. And at the biochemical level, dopamine signals are widely thought to play a crucial role in this process. And the thing is that most drugs known to be addictive are also known to affect the availability of dopamine in the reward system by a variety of different chemical means. So this is supposed to lead to the system being hijacked by drugs, as it is sometimes put, and as drugs directly confound the chemical parameter that computes reward value. So the system is led to assign ever-increasing reward value to these substances, which then translates in an ever-increasing motivation to seek and use drugs. And note that on this view, the behavioral level features are portrayed as downstream effects of this primary neural level issue. So the points I want to raise do not dispute the main features of the empirical description of what is going on according to this view in the reward system, but rather on the grounds for claiming that is a dysfunction or the core dysfunction that is taking place in cases of addiction. So I have three arguments for that claim, and I turn now to my main points. The first one addresses the brain disease model directly by posing a challenge, which is what could the neural level criterion be to distinguish between pathological and non-pathological brain change in the context of addiction. And the motivation for this challenge is that at present we currently lack any purely neural level means to identify dysfunction or pathology in cases of addiction. So basically everything we know about the neural correlates of addiction is based on a prior decision about which individuals suffer from this condition that relies entirely on personal level criteria. But the deeper issue is not that we currently lack this criterion, this neural level criterion, but the fact that we do not have any clear idea at present of what the criterion would look like. And I mean, again, the criterion that would allow us to say these brain changes are pathological and these brain changes are, say, normal developments. And the thing is that brains are highly plastic organs and they are supposed to change in response to experience. So just evidence of addiction-related change is obviously insufficient for the claim that a dysfunction is present. And so you may think that the way to go here concerns brain damage, if that were the correct way of picturing this, which would arguably be like obviously pathological in nature. And I do not have a quarrel with the claim that we could take brain lesions or maybe a reduction in gray matter to be interpreted as pathological in neural level terms, but very much the way in which a brain tumor may be seen as pathological without resorting to extra neural criteria. But in the context of addiction, whatever brain damage we take to be involved seems to be more plausibly pictured as a consequence of temporally sustained drug intake, and not instead as the primary neural marker of addictive dysfunction. So it is arguably more plausibly pictured as a harmful consequence of addiction rather than the core dysfunction of addiction itself. So I think this first issue, this first argument, this is not, of course, a knockdown argument, because among other things, because internalism is a metaphysical claim. So you could hold the internalistic view even if we have no idea of how to make this distinction between pathological and healthy brain change. But I still think that this puts the defender of the brain disease model in a somewhat precarious position. So my second argument concerns what is sometimes called a mismatch account of addiction, of which there are some versions out there. So the basic story here is that there is a way of picturing things under which the reward system may not be malfunctioning at all, but rather it may be pictured as doing exactly what it is meant to do, which is identifying highly rewarding stuff by picking up on what stuff is related to the relevant sort of dopamine signal, and consequently influencing behavior guidance systems in a way that maximizes the chances of acquiring rewarding stuff. So in this, if you frame things this way, then maybe the system is doing what it's supposed to do. So a key consideration is that all mammals share the addiction vulnerability, and humans' reward system is not a late acquisition in evolutionary terms, but still addiction does not appear to be a naturally occurring issue for non-human animals. I mean, it does not happen outside of human-made or human-modified environments. So it seems that, as a matter of fact, the possibility for addiction to be an issue only arises under a certain range of environmental conditions, and these conditions are only possible when the relevant technical means are available. I mean, the technical means which are needed to have access to drugs in sufficient quantities, basically. So what is the thought here? It goes something like this. Every biological system is designed in a way that leads to adaptive, or if you want, desirable consequences under a certain range of environmental conditions. I mean, that seems like to be generally true. So if that contingent link is severe between the way the system operates and the conditions under which it was designed to operate, if that contingent link does not hold, then harmful consequences may follow from such a mismatch without the need to picture that the relevant system is malfunctioning. So this line of reasoning, I take it, is compatible with two possibilities. Either there is no dysfunction at all, which I take to be an open possibility, or there is a dysfunction, albeit not one that can be described solely in terms of what the internal mechanism is doing. And I am personally inclined to endorse these latter options. But both options pose a problem for the internalistic account of dysfunction. So to turn to my third argument, this involves a case. Imagine that someone correctly pictured as an addict find themselves in a situation where it is permanently impossible to procure drugs for whatever reason. Say they found themselves in a desert island, or there is like a apocalyptic end of the world sort of scenario where drugs become permanently unavailable, and everyone knows this. So the question is whether this person who was correctly pictured as an addict just a minute ago continue to suffer from the relevant dysfunction after this unlikely turn of events. And the internalistic view is, of course, committed to the claim that they do, because like nothing changed with the way the internal systems are working. So if there was dysfunction just a minute ago, it should continue to be there. And the story under the internalistic account would arguably play out in dispositional terms. So drug use, addictive drug use, is no longer a possible occurrence in this context, but but it would need to be framed as not occurring because the manifestation conditions do not obtain, but the dysfunction could still be interpreted in dispositional terms. That would need to be the internalistic view. So the question is then whether a permanently non-actualized disposition to addictive behavior can be sensibly pictured as an addiction. And I mean, to put it differently, the question would be, what would asymptomatic addiction even amount to? And the difficulty for the internalistic account is that rather than a symptom of addiction, impaired control appears to be the problem itself. So it is hard to grasp what could be a non-ad hoc ground for claiming that a dysfunction is present in the absence of a failure of the ability to control drug-related behavior. A dispositional account is possible, but then the issue is, what are the grounds for favoring such an account? And this relates to the issue of chronicity of addiction. In a way, I mean, I can go back to this later in Q&A if you want. But the picture of addiction as a chronic condition, I mean, in the actual world, that is itself controversial for a reason rather similar to the one I am getting at, which is that the reason for picturing addiction as a chronic condition, even in the absence of addictive behavior and for extended periods of time, is that the relapse rates for addiction are really high. But then that argument seems to confound risk with pathology, and these two seem to be two fundamentally different notions. So again, it is hard to see the grounds for saying that there is actual dysfunction rather than, say, a risk of relapse when addictive behavior is not an actual occurrence over extended periods of time. And for starters, people in that situation do not meet diagnostic criteria for addiction. So consider these contrast cases to go back to the desert island scenario. Cardiovascular issues, brain lesions, and arguably Tourette's tics all seem to be expressive of a dysfunction in a way that would transfer to the desert island scenario, as these things would seemingly not be affected by the envisioned change in circumstances. But impaired control over drug use seems to be inextricably linked to a certain range of environmental conditions, which include, among other things, the availability of the relevant substances. And I just a couple of quick notes on this before wrapping up. It is not coincidental that addiction treatment programs often focus on environmental interventions. So a drastic change of setting is widely believed to be a powerful means for improving the ability to control drug-related behavior. And in cases where an admission to a facility is recommended, the rationale for this is often framed in terms of the need to produce a radical change in environmental conditions. And there is also a wealth of evidence in the addiction literature, including many classic studies that you may have heard of, like the studies, the so-called rat park studies, and the evidence concerning addiction by military personnel while on the front, which then does not appear to transfer to their situation upon returning home. So there is a wealth of evidence, I mean, not fantasy-like scenarios, which points to the crucial role of environmental circumstances in explaining addictive drug use. So in the paper, I go into some length to articulate more fully what the externalistic view of dysfunction would look like. But the picture I'm putting together with these considerations already starts to resemble the externalistic account. If relevant environmental features did not play the requisite role, then there would arguably be no dysfunction. There will be no grounds for claiming that the situation is still a dysfunction. So I consider a couple of possible moves by an advocate of the internalistic view. One is to point to the presence of non-dispositional signs of dysfunction that would transfer to the desert island scenario. And the two more plausible candidates for that are withdrawal symptoms and craving and constant preoccupation. These are things that you may think the person still suffers from in the desert island scenario. So there are signs that the dysfunction is still there. And let me reply to this very briefly before I conclude. Withdrawal symptoms are, I take it, the feature of addiction which is best suited for an internalistic account. But then the issue is that there are many kinds of addiction which do not involve withdrawal symptoms in any prominent way. So if we take that all cases of addiction involve the same core dysfunction, which could be taken to be present in the impairment of control issue, then withdrawal symptoms would not appear to be the key to whatever dysfunction there is in the context of addiction, for the simple reason that they are not present in any prominent way in many sorts of addiction. I mean, there are ways in which the argument could go on concerning withdrawal symptoms, but I'll skip that for now. And the other issue concerned craving and constant preoccupation. And I think this is interesting because I think it is very much an open question, the extent to which craving and constant preoccupation would be transferred to the desert island scenario. And this is grounded in some evidence that we have in the actual world studies concerning the way in which desires are affected by beliefs concerning target availability. So, for instance, a number of studies show that craving increases or tends to increase with the expectation that an opportunity to use will be available soon. So this suggests that maybe craving and constant preoccupation would still be experienced. I'm not suggesting that they would instantly vanish, but they may be experienced in attenuated forms in these sort of circumstances. And if that were the case, then arguably that would not be enough of ground for claiming that a dysfunction is still occurring. So to recap, I've argued that the internalistic view of addictive dysfunction is in serious trouble. My main three arguments are that we have no neural level account of the contrast between healthy and pathological brain processes, that there are reasons to think that the relevant brain systems may not be malfunctioning, at least not at the level of description to which the internalistic view is committed to. And the third argument is that the same neural level features transferred to a different environment seem not to be enough to ground the claim that a dysfunction is present. So if I'm right, then either addiction does not actually involve a dysfunction, or the dysfunction would need to be accounted for in externalistic terms. But in other case, the conjunction between the dysfunction-based disorder claim and psychiatric internalism turns out to be untenable. And as a result, one could deny that addiction is a disorder, or support the disorder claim on non-dysfunction related grounds, or endorse an externalistic view of addictive dysfunction. So that's my conclusion, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fede. Now we have time for questions. Sebas, you're first.
Thank you very much, Fede. That was very interesting, but I was wondering, how can you deal with the discussion without getting into the details of what counts as functioning? It might be that you have an idea. So I guess that you want to make room for the possibility of having an idea of malfunction, which is compatible with internalism. And then, if this is the case, I have doubts about your argument. So imagine the following. Imagine that I have a theory of blindness, and I find blindness as a dysfunction, okay? And I'm an internalist about blindness. I think that blindness has to do with such and such damage in the brain, okay? Now, here's one example, like your island example. So imagine that the blind person is brought into a cave where there is no light. And now the function, in this situation, there is no difference between someone who is blind and someone who is not, because they cannot be used. The disposition cannot be actualized, and hence the account fails. So I have to be an externalist. So that might be a good reason for being in general an externalist about functions, but I guess that's not your point. So I would like to hear what you think about those cases, and to have a better understanding of the dialectic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sebas. Something that I'm a bit concerned about is whether I can actually pull off this argument without really committing to a theory of what function and dysfunction are. But I guess that in your case, the grounds for picturing, the grounds for the internalistic account are related to the fact that there is brain damage, which is like the causally responsible for the deficit in visual capacity. But so that would lead to my first sort of argument, because in the context of addiction, there is the dysfunction which is arguably related to this loss of ability to control drug-related behavior that is in no obvious way tied to something like brain damage. So in the case of blindness, if there is, discernible, identifiable damage to the visual cortex, then that would be a good account on I take it that would be a good account. But there is nothing like that in the context of addiction.
The important part, so for the question, the only important part, I give you an example. So imagine another condition, and that was just an example. Now that we know that there is a brain damage, but imagine that we don't know, or we're not able to find it, or imagine a different condition. So we want to discuss our conditions, and we don't know whether we haven't searched good enough, or whether it's just something internalist. We have only a fight between the internalist and the externalist. My guess is that I can always find island similar scenarios, and the internalist will say, I'm not moved at all by that kind of argument. That was the point that I was trying to bring forward. That's the only thing.
Yeah, in the end, this is like a battle of intuitions. I realized that there is a position that the internalist could retreat to, which is, it is consistent. What I'm trying to argue is that it is implausible. But again, I think it is a key issue that it doesn't look like anything resembling brain damage will be forthcoming as an account of the neural basis of addiction. And people have made the argument that what is going on with the reward system could be portrayed as like an unfortunate case of overlearning, which leads to harmful consequences and that puts people in a poor position, but which is not correctly pictured as the system malfunctioning, which is arguably different from the blindness case. But I take it that you're right, that there is still, a viable internalistic view people could hold on to. Yeah.
Aida?
Yeah, thank you. That was a really thought-provoking and very interesting talk. So I have a question about how this externalist view of proper functions may look like. And I would like you to say a bit more about this. So just to give you an example to start thinking about this coming from the biological world, because sometimes those examples are easier to think. So we may think that there's an insect, Letosaurus, that has an extended digestion process, right? So the way digestion works for Letosaurus is that he injects its prey with some substance that does the digestive process outside of the stomach, right? And so the skin of the prey is being used to contain, to hold that digestive process and to contain the breakdown of the nutrients and so on for Letosaurus. So in that case, will we be saying something like the skin of the prey actually has the proper function to hold the digestive process or to contain the digestive process, or some proper function or another? Because that's a genuine question I have myself, and I was thinking, if we I'm very curious on how this externalist view of this function may work, because usually when we speak of function, I guess here you mean proper functions. We take it that there's something that has a certain proper function given a proper function endowing event or another. So if you have the selective effects view of proper functions, right, there has been some selective event in the past that has endowed something with certain proper function. But here in this externalist take on addiction, I'm not quite sure what is it that it's dysfunctional, what was its proper function to start with, and whether we can talk about proper functions that are not on things that are not biological individuals, other than artifacts, for instance, by a design fact or another. So anyway, I was just curious on what you will say about these things.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I wish I had something more definitive to say to that. I mean, the reason why I am attempting to do this without committing to a particular view of what function and dysfunction are is because I am aware of the problems that the accounts on offer have, and including something like, in this context, it would be something like maybe Wakefield's account of function in evolutionary terms. I mean, you could have other views, but they would all, get me into the messy debates about what function is, and I'm trying to avoid that by resorting to this intuition, which I am not fully committed to, but it is convincing to my mind that addictive behavior seems to be the upshot of something going wrong in some way. I mean, some mechanism going wrong in some way, and the place to look, I claim, is the impaired ability to control drug-related behavior. So I do have more to say on impaired control, and I have an externalistic view of impaired control. So I think that the ability to control drug-related behavior depends on a number of extra individual features. So I have more to say on that, but then whether that is enough, that picture of there being a loss of expectable ability to control drug-related behavior, and how that ability seems to be inextricably linked to a certain range of environmental features. Whether that is enough to support the claim that there is indeed a dysfunction, that is, something that is less clear to my mind. But my main point, the main point behind all this is an externalistic view of control, which seems to be like the primary issue that is going wrong in cases of addiction. If you have further thoughts about that, I would be glad to hear them.
Not for now. Maybe I'll save myself for after the next question.
Thank you.
Yafan?
Thanks. Really enjoyed the talk. I learned a lot. My question concerns, there's a part in the talk where you separated out the harm aspects and the loss of ability or the lack of manifestation of ability aspects of dysfunction. You're arguing that, well, harm is a lot of times accompanying dysfunction in the context of addiction, but it's not essential. What's essential is this lack of or loss of some expected ability. So my question really is just, I when I was going through that part of the talk, I thought the argument is a little bit quick. So I'm wondering if you could explain the argument a little bit more, like what is the basis for saying that harm is not essential to dysfunction in this context of talking about addiction? At least for me, like intuitively, it's not entirely clear that a loss or the lack of manifestation of some ability without any harm attached to it will count as a dysfunction. It's not entirely clear to my mind. So I'm wondering what would be your argument for making that transition in that part of the talk. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean that's another tricky issue. So just to, there are number of ways you could frame this. Uh, Maybe harm is necessary for there being an addiction in the first place. So maybe you could picture this as there being like this dysfunctional aspect related to impaired control. But you may argue that if there is no harm, then there is no addiction proper. Or otherwise, you could say that that the issue with impaired control is like the key feature of addiction, but then there is no disorder if there is no harm related to this. I mean, these are like two different possibilities. But I do tend to think that the dysfunction issue and the harm issue are at least conceptually different. So, I mean, in the real world, they are very tightly tied. As you know, it's very, very, very hard to picture how the impairment of control could not lead to harmful consequences. But it seems that conceptually they could be separated, and you know, you could, if you are into that, you could think of something like Frankfurt's willing addict. So Frankfurt's willing addict has no ability to control drug-related behavior, but is fully content with everything that follows from that, and fully identifies with his drug-oriented desires and so forth. So, I mean, that is, of course, a fantasy case. But it seems that conceptually, you could have an impaired ability to control drug use, even if, as a matter of fact, no harm ensues. But I believe you're right if that is the point that you're getting at, that would be highly unusual. I mean, addiction involves harm, I take it. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Elizabeth?
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. This is a pretty trivial point. Yeah, it's not an objection or a question or really a substantive comment. But on your internalist, one of your internist replies about withdrawal symptoms, you mentioned that, you know, this doesn't hold a lot of weight because there's lots of cases of addiction that don't pose withdrawal symptoms. And I think the opposite is also true. There's all kinds of medications that can cause withdrawal symptoms upon reduction that don't seem to really be used in addiction context. So I feel like that helps your point there.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do believe that the reply concerning withdrawal symptoms is probably like the best way to go for the internalistic view. As you know, I think it is very plausible to think that this could transfer to the desert island scenario, and this would not be highly affected by environmental circumstances. And then actually in the paper, I do something else which I didn't get into here for lack of time, which is that I mean, my argument on that point is that withdrawal symptoms could not be like the key issue, given that there are kinds of addiction that do not involve prominent withdrawal symptoms. But then there is another way in which the argument could go on, which is that maybe these different sorts of addiction are not of a fundamentally common kind. And maybe what usually goes under the name of addiction should in fact be pictured as different sub conditions or something like that, or sub kinds. And then maybe my argument then would not apply to all kinds. But yeah, I mean, it's your point is interesting in any case. Thank you.
Well, I think there are no more questions, and we are kind of on time. I only have like words to thank you all for having joined us these couple of days. There have been so many interesting things I've heard, I've learned. It's been a couple of very enriching or well, whatever days. So thank you, and we hope to keep in touch with all of you and keep working together and hearing your interesting thoughts about this and other stuff. I don't know if Diana or Fede would like to say anything else. If not, I thank you all and keep in touch.
I mean, I also want to thank everyone who joined the discussion, and all the speakers for the wonderful talks. Let me say that I was not supposed to close the workshop, but we had a last talk that dropped out at the last minute. But anyway, thank you all for these really two wonderful sessions, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch with all of you and keep discussing philosophy with all of you. Diana?
Oh, it's okay. Thank you all. That it was great. 2 wonderful days. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.